I am Theodore Coleman, 75 years old, and my story begins with a choice between my dignity and my family's greed. I paid $22,500 for my granddaughter's 18th birthday party. A week before the event, my daughter-in-law texted to inform me I was uninvited. She said my presence would, and I quote, ruin the vibe. So I made a few phone calls. And when my son finally got through to me after 50 frantic attempts, he learned that the party was gone. What he didn't know yet was that a $250,000 inheritance had vanished right along with it. Before I tell you the rest of this story, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to teach someone that respect is not for sale. The silence in my apartment was the comfortable kind. The kind you earn after a lifetime of noise of raising a child of 50 years of marriage to a woman whose laughter was music. It settled around me like a well-worn armchair. On the polished surface of my dining table, a stack of invoices sat like trophies. $22,500. I let my finger trace the elegant cursive of Magnolia Events. $7,000 for a tent that could withstand a Georgia hurricane draped in silk and strung with what the brochure called a constellation of fairy lights. My Lena, she would have loved that. She always dreamed of a garden party for our granddaughter Brianna. A real one like in the old movies she adored, with a jazz band and dancing under the stars. I could almost hear her voice, a warm whisper in the quiet room, telling me not to skimp on the flowers. And I hadn't. $2,000 for white orchids flown in fresh from Hawaii. Lena always said orchids reminded her of a promise of beauty that lasts. The next invoice was from the Midnight Train, a local jazz band, $4,000. They were our band, mine and Lena's. We danced to their music at our 40th anniversary right in the backyard of the house we built with our own two hands, the house I sold last year. My son Marcus and his wife Ashley had called it downsizing, a practical move for a man my age. They said it was for my own good to free up capital to let me enjoy my retirement without the burden of property taxes and a leaky roof. I knew they meant well, or at least that's what I told myself. But selling that house felt like tearing out a chapter of my own soul. Every brick, every floorboard held a memory of Lena. Her laughter still echoed in the empty hallways if I listened closely enough. This party, this extravagant, over-the-top celebration for Brianna's 18th birthday, was my way of honoring her memory. It was funded entirely by that sale. It was Lena's legacy transformed into one perfect, unforgettable night for the granddaughter she adored. I picked up the final invoice, the heaviest one. Lena's Kitchen. $10,000 for catering. It wasn't just a name, it was her name. The owner, a woman named Cynthia, was someone Lena had mentored years ago, helping her turn a small baking hobby into the most sought-after catering business in Atlanta. Using her service felt like having a piece of my wife right there at the party. I imagined the taste of the shrimp and grits, the sweet potato pie made from Lena's own recipe. It was all for Brianna, my granddaughter, a bright girl heading to college soon. This party was meant to be her grand send-off, a launching pad into her future, all built on the foundation of the past, on the love and sacrifice of a grandmother she was just beginning to forget. I leaned back in my chair, a small, proud smile on my face. Every dollar was a testament, every detail was a memory. The plan was perfect. In that peaceful moment, surrounded by the ghosts of a happy life, I had no idea that the foundation I had so carefully built was about to be shattered by the cold, casual cruelty of a text message. I did not reply to the text. To engage would be to validate the insult, to grant it the dignity of a response. My silence would be my answer, a void into which their cruelty could echo. For a long time, I just sat there, the phone dark on the table, the words burned into my mind. I read them again and again, not because I didn't understand, but because I was trying to find a version of them that didn't feel like a knife twisting in my chest. Each time, the words remained the same, cold and absolute. I began to dissect them the way an engineer takes apart a failed machine, looking for the precise point of fracture. The first point was the phrase, old people. It was a blanket term, a label used to strip away individuality. It wasn't Grandpa or Theo. It was a category. A problem to be managed. 75 years of life of experience, of love and loss, of building bridges and raising a family, all reduced to a demographic inconvenience. The phrase suggested I was not a participant in life anymore, but a relic to be dusted off for holidays and then put back on the shelf. It implied I was out of touch, irrelevant, a black and white photograph in their high-definition world. I thought of the calluses on my hands from a lifetime of work, the lines on my face that were a map of every laugh and every tear I had shared with Lena. All of it, my entire history, was bundled together and dismissed as simply old. Then came the second, more insidious phrase. Ruin the vibe. Vibe. Such a flimsy, transient word. It was the language of nightclubs and social media influencers, and it was being used to describe my effect on my own family. My presence, the very air I breathed, was considered a contamination. It would spoil the carefully curated atmosphere of youthful joy, an atmosphere built with my money, my sacrifice, my legacy. The hypocrisy of it was breathtaking. I was the ghost at the feast, but a ghost who was still expected to pay the bill. I imagined Brianna, my beautiful granddaughter, surrounded by her friends, laughing and dancing in a tent paid for by her grandfather, the same grandfather she felt would be a blight on her perfect evening. The thought was not just painful, it was profoundly disillusioning. It felt like I had spent my life building a home only to be told I was no longer welcome inside because my shadow was the wrong shape. As I sat there in the crushing silence of my apartment, something began to shift inside me. The initial searing pain did not disappear. Instead, it began to change its state like water freezing into ice. It cooled, hardened, and became something else entirely. A profound, chilling clarity. The fog of familial obligation, of making excuses for their behavior, of telling myself they don't really mean it, evaporated. I saw them for exactly who they were. I saw Ashley not as a stressed mother trying to plan a party, but as a cold, calculating opportunist who valued appearances above all else. I saw Marcus, my son, not as a man caught in the middle, but as a coward who had abdicated his role as a son to appease his wife's shallow ambitions. And I saw Brianna not as an innocent teenager, but as a product of their toxic values, a girl who had been taught that love was conditional and respect was disposable. The text wasn't a mistake, it was a revelation. It was the truth of my position in their lives delivered with brutal efficiency. And as the ice settled in my veins, the pain was replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. The hurt was still there, a deep, permanent ache, but it was no longer a weakness. It was now my armor. My gaze drifted from the dark screen of the phone away from the sterile, cruel words and the neat columns of figures on the invoices. My eyes found their familiar resting place, the portrait of Lena that hung above the fireplace. It was painted for our 50th anniversary, a gift from Marcus. The artist had captured her perfectly. Not just the elegant lines of her face or the warmth in her brown eyes, but the spirit behind them. The quiet strength, the unwavering integrity, the hint of a smile that said she understood the world's foolishness but chose to love it anyway. Looking at her, it felt as though she was in the room with me, a silent, steady presence in the face of this ugly storm. The silence in the room no longer felt like an absence, a void where her laughter used to be. It transformed. It became a space filled with her memory, a sanctuary where I could think. In that quiet, I could almost hear her voice, as clear as if she were standing right beside me. She was never one for hysterics. When faced with injustice, she didn't raise her voice. She lowered it. Her anger was a cold, focused thing, sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Don't you let them walk all over you, Theo," her voice echoed in my memory. "You are a Coleman. You stand tall." I remembered a time years ago when Marcus came home from school with a torn shirt and a black eye. A bully had been taking his lunch money. I had been ready to march over to the bully's house and confront his father, but Lena had stopped me. She sat Marcus down at the kitchen table, cleaned his wounds, and taught him how to look a man in the eye and say no, with a voice that didn't shake. "Dignity isn't something people give you," she had told him. "It's something you refuse to let them take away." Where was that boy now? The man who was my son had forgotten that lesson. Looking at Lena's portrait, a vow began to form in my heart, a silent promise to the woman I had loved for half a century. This was not just about my hurt feelings. This was about our legacy. The money for this party, every single dollar, came from the sale of our home. It was the physical embodiment of 40 years of our shared work, our sacrifices, our dreams. It was her money as much as mine. The thought of that legacy being used to fund an event built on such casual, callous disrespect, an event where her husband was explicitly unwelcome, was in desecration. I would not allow it. I would not let them tarnish her memory by turning the fruits of our life together into a monument to their own entitlement. The party they wanted, the one where I was a shameful secret, would not happen. This was no longer just about canceling a party. It was about re-establishing an order. The order of respect. The order of decency. A foundation had been cracked, and if I did not fix it, the whole house would collapse. The decision settled over me not with anger, but with a profound and solemn sense of duty. My grief for Lena, which was a constant gentle ache, now became a source of strength. I was not just acting for myself. I was acting for both of us. The decision was made. I pushed my chair back from the dining table. The scrape of the wood against the floor was the only sound in the apartment, a sharp, decisive noise that marked the end of my inaction. I walked not with the slow, careful steps of a 75-year-old man, but with the steady, measured pace of an engineer approaching a complex problem. My destination was the mahogany side table next to my armchair. On it sat my old leather-bound address book. It was a relic from another time, its pages filled with 50 years of contacts, of friends, of business associates, of people who knew me not as an old man who ruined the vibe, but as Theodore Coleman, a man whose word was his bond. People who understood the meaning of a handshake, of a promise of respect. I carried it back to the dining table and sat down. The battlefield was set. On one side, the stack of glossy impersonal invoices representing their world of shallow transactions. On the other, my worn address book, a testament to a life built on genuine relationships. This book was my arsenal. I opened it, its spine cracking softly like the joints of an old friend. The faint, pleasant smell of old paper and ink filled the air, a scent of history and permanence. My finger, though slightly stiff with age, traced down the columns of names written in my own fading ink. So many of them were gone now, their names a quiet memorial to a life fully lived. But many remained, people of character. People who remembered Lena. People who knew what the Coleman name stood for. My plan was not a messy act of revenge. It was a precise, structural demolition. I would take apart their perfect party piece by piece, starting with its most important pillar. I flipped through the worn pages, past the A's, the B's, the C's. My finger stopped on the letter D. My eyes scanned the list of names until I found the one I was looking for. Mrs. Eleanor Dubois, Magnolia Events, the $7,000 tent, the $2,000 orchids, Lena's old friend from her bridge club. I looked at her number for a long moment. This first call would be the hardest, but it was the most necessary. It was the first stone to be removed from the foundation, and I knew its removal would send tremors through the entire structure. With a steady hand, I picked up my telephone. My face, I am sure, was a mask of perfect calm. It was the calm of a man who has already weathered the storm inside himself and is now ready to unleash it upon the world. As I dialed the number, I felt no anger, no hesitation, only the cold, clean certainty of an engineer about to correct a fatal design flaw. The phone began to ring. The plan had begun. The phone rang 3 times, each electronic chirp sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. I counted them, my knuckles white, as I gripped the receiver. This was the first domino. The one that once pushed would make the rest of the chain reaction inevitable. A warm, familiar voice answered, smooth and professional, but with an underlying kindness I recognized immediately. Magnolia Events. This is Eleanor Dubois speaking. I had known Eleanor for nearly 40 years. She and Lena had been in the same bridge club, a weekly ritual of cards, gossip, and shared confidences. I had chosen her company for that very reason, believing it would add a personal touch, a connection to our past. Now that personal connection felt like a blade twisting in my gut. Eleanor, it's Theodore Coleman, I said. My voice was steady, calmer than I felt. I was an engineer, I reminded myself. I dealt in facts and structures, not messy emotions. Theo, how wonderful to hear from you, she said, her tone instantly shifting from the professional efficiency of a business owner to the genuine warmth of an old friend. I was just reviewing the final lighting schematics for Brianna's party this morning. It's going to be absolutely spectacular. The orchids arrived today, and they are breathtaking. Lena would be so proud of what you're doing for that girl. Her words, meant to be kind, landed like a punch. Proud. Lena would be proud of a party her husband was forbidden from attending. She would be proud that the granddaughter she cherished was ashamed of her own grandfather. The irony was a bitter acid in my throat. I had to swallow before I could speak. Actually, Eleanor, that's why I'm calling, I said, keeping my voice level, devoid of the storm that was raging inside me. There's been a change in plans, a rather significant one. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could picture her in her elegant office, a pen poised over a blueprint, a small frown creasing her brow. "Oh," she said, the single word laced with confusion. "Is everything all right, Theo? Has something happened?" The genuine concern in her voice made what I was about to do feel like a betrayal. I was about to lie to a friend of 40 years, a woman who had sat with me at my wife's funeral and held my hand. But it was a necessary betrayal. This was a war, and she was, however, unintentionally on the other side. "Everything is fine." I lied. The words felt like ash in my mouth. "It's just a private family matter, a sudden development. We've decided to cancel the event." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. I could hear the faint sound of a clock ticking in her office. She wasn't just a vendor processing a cancellation. She was a friend trying to understand an inexplicable decision. "Cancel," she finally said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and worry. "Theo, the entire event is paid for. The deposits are non-refundable. We're a week out. Everything is in place." "I'm aware of that," I said calmly. "I'm not asking for a refund. I am simply informing you that the party on Saturday is no longer happening. You and your staff can stand down." This was not the language of a grieving grandfather. This was the language of a command. She recognized it. "Theo, this isn't like you," she said, her voice soft, now probing. "Is this about Marcus and Ashley? Is Brianna okay?" She was getting too close. I had to end this. "Eleanor, I appreciate your concern," I said, my tone becoming formal, creating a distance between us. "But this is a family decision. I will not discuss it further. Please consider this my official notification." I didn't give her a chance to reply. "Thank you for your understanding." I added a hollow courtesy before I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. The click of the phone severing the connection was the first sound of the demolition. The first domino had fallen, and I knew with absolute certainty that the tremors were already on their way to my son's house. I did not hang up the phone with any sense of satisfaction, only a grim sense of necessity. The conversation with Eleanor had left a sour taste in my mouth. Lying to an old friend was a heavy price to pay, but I knew it was just the first of many. I looked back at my list. The next name was the midnight train. A wave of genuine pain washed over me, a much sharper pang than I had felt when speaking with Eleanor. This was different. This was personal. The midnight train wasn't just a vendor. They were a part of my history, a part of my love story with Lena. I remembered the first time we heard them play. It was at a small smoky club in downtown Atlanta sometime back in the late 70s. Lena had dragged me there, promising the best live jazz I would ever hear. She was right. From the moment the first note from the saxophone filled the air, we were captivated. The band leader, a cool, charismatic man named Ray, played with a passion that felt like he was telling a story with every note. That night, I held Lena close on the tiny dance floor, her head resting on my shoulder, and we swayed to their music for hours. They became our band. We saw them countless times over the years. They played at our 40th anniversary party in the backyard of our old house under a string of lanterns. Ray, older then, but just as passionate, had dedicated our favorite song to us. Seeing them perform at Brianna's party was meant to be a bridge, a way to connect my granddaughter's future with the most beautiful parts of my past. Canceling them felt like cutting one of the last remaining threads to those memories. My hand hesitated over the phone. For a moment, I considered skipping this call, letting them show up to a party that didn't exist. But that would be chaos, not strategy. It would be cruel to them, and they had done nothing to deserve it. My plan required precision, not collateral damage. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and cold in my lungs, and dialed the number. An upbeat jazzy tune played as the hold music before a familiar gravelly voice answered. "Ray speaking." "Ray, it's Theodore Coleman," I said. "Theo, my man." His voice boomed with warmth. "I was just thinking about you and the lovely Lena the other day. We're all polished up and ready to bring the house down for your granddaughter. We've even been rehearsing that old Ellington tune Lena loved so much." His words were a gut punch. He was honoring my wife's memory while my own family was erasing mine. The injustice of it all fueled the resolve I needed. "Ray, I'm afraid I'm calling with some bad news," I said, my voice flat. "I need to cancel the booking for Saturday." The warmth in his voice vanished, replaced by confusion. "Cancel, Theo. What's going on? Is the party off?" "Yes," I said, the single word feeling like a betrayal of every happy memory I had with his music. "A sudden, unavoidable family situation has come up. The celebration has been postponed indefinitely." I hated the lie. Ray was a good man. He and his band deserved better than a vague corporate-sounding excuse. But the truth was, a weapon I was not yet ready to reveal. "Man, that's a real shame," he said, and I could hear the genuine disappointment in his voice. "Is everyone okay? Is there anything I can do?" "No, but I appreciate you asking," I said. "I know this is a massive inconvenience. You'll be paid in full for your time, of course. I'll have a check sent over tomorrow." "Don't worry about the money, Theo," he said quickly. "Just take care of yourself and your family. That's what's important." His decency was another small twist of the knife. "Thank you, Ray," I said. "That means a lot." I ended the call, the silence rushing back in heavier this time. 2 down. The music had been silenced, and the cold, quiet work of demolition continued. I hung up the phone with Ray, the silence rushing back in heavier this time. Each call was chipping away at something inside me, a small piece of my own history. My eyes scanned the list on the table, past the crossed-out names of the event planner and the band, and then they landed on the final name, Lena's Kitchen. My breath caught in my throat. This was the one I had been dreading. This call was not about business. It was about legacy. The 2 words sat on the page not as a business title, but as a monument to my wife's kindness, to her belief in other people. I remembered Cynthia when she was just a young single mother with a gift for baking and a mountain of debt. She worked 2 jobs cleaning offices at night and waitressing on weekends, all while trying to raise her daughter. Lena had met her at a church bake sale. Cynthia had brought a sweet potato pie that Lena said tasted like a memory of home. Lena didn't just see a good baker. She saw a fire in that young woman's eyes, a desperate will to succeed. She took Cynthia under her wing. She mentored her, taught her about bookkeeping, helped her write a business plan on our old kitchen table. And when the time was right, Lena gave her the seed money from her own small savings to rent a small commercial kitchen space. "Everyone deserves a chance to build something beautiful," Lena had told me. "All they need is for one person to believe in them." When Cynthia insisted on naming the business after her, Lena had cried. Hiring Lena's Kitchen to cater Brianna's party was the easiest decision I had made. It was my way of bringing a part of my wife to the celebration, a tribute to her spirit of generosity. It was meant to be a beautiful, full-circle moment. Cynthia, now a successful and respected business owner, would be serving food made from Lena's recipes at a party for Lena's granddaughter, and now I had to call that same woman and undo it all. How could I do it? How could I lie to her, calling Eleanor? And Ray felt like a strategic move in a war I didn't want to fight. Calling Cynthia felt different. It felt like a betrayal, not just of a business owner, but of my wife's memory itself. My hand rested on the phone, heavy as lead. For a moment my resolve wavered. The guilt was a physical thing, a sickness in the pit of my stomach. And then another thought, sharp and clear as a bell, cut through the fog of my guilt. What would be the greater betrayal, to tell a small, necessary lie to protect her honor, or to stand by and allow her legacy, the money from the home she built, the food from the business she inspired, to fund an event that celebrated her own family's disrespect for everything she stood for? The choice became instantly painfully clear. I was not betraying Lena. I was protecting her. My jaw tightened. The wavering stopped. I picked up the phone and dialed the number before I could allow myself to doubt it again. "Lena's Kitchen, you've got Cynthia." Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and full of life, with a laugh always just beneath the surface. "Mr. Coleman, I was just going over the menu again. I added a little something extra to the sweet potato pie, just the way Lena used to like it, with a hint of nutmeg. We're so excited for Saturday." The kindness of her words was almost unbearable. "Cynthia," I began, my voice a low, somber tone, "I'm afraid I have to call you about the party." The laughter in her voice died instantly. "Oh my goodness, Mr. Coleman, is everyone all right? Is there anything I can do?" Her immediate concern was for me, not for her business. It made the lie I was about to tell feel even more grotesque. "There has been a private family emergency," I said, the words tasting like poison. "It's sudden. We've had to cancel the party." "Oh, Theo, I am so sorry to hear that," she said, her voice full of genuine sympathy. "Please don't you worry about a thing with us. You just take care of your family. That's all that matters." I ended the call, my hand trembling slightly as I placed the phone back down. The guilt was still there, a hot coal in my stomach. But it was now surrounded by the ice of my resolve. The final and most important pillar of the party had been removed. Now all that was left was to wait for the collapse. After the call with Cynthia, I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a final quiet click. The work was done. All 3 pillars of the party had been removed. Now all I had to do was wait. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel glee. I felt only the grim, hollow satisfaction of a surgeon who has just completed a painful but necessary amputation. I sat in my armchair, the one Lena had always said was the most comfortable, and I watched the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. I was the calm eye of a hurricane that I myself had set in motion, and I knew with the certainty of an engineer who understands structural integrity that the winds were about to hit my son's house. I could picture it perfectly. Ashley in the middle of some trivial task, perhaps confirming the color of the napkins or finalizing the seating chart for a party that no longer existed. Her phone would ring. She would see Eleanor Dubois's name and answer with that bright, falsely cheerful voice she used for business. She would expect a simple confirmation, a minor question. Instead, she would be met with Eleanor's concerned professional tone explaining that Mr. Coleman had canceled the entire event. Ashley's first reaction would be disbelief, followed by a flash of annoyance. A misunderstanding, a senior moment. She would reassure Eleanor, tell her that my father-in-law must be confused and that she would sort it out immediately. She would hang up irritated at the inconvenience, ready to call me and put me in my place. But before she could dial my number, her phone would ring again. This time it would be Cynthia from Lena's kitchen, her voice full of worried sympathy, asking if everything was all right, explaining that Mr. Coleman had called about a family emergency and canceled the catering. This is where the annoyance would curdle into alarm. 1 call is a mistake, 2 is a pattern. Her mind would start racing. What was he doing? Was this some kind of senile power play? Her frustration would mount, her carefully constructed world of social perfection beginning to tremble. Then before she could even process the second call, a third might come in from Ray, the band leader, with a similar story. That is when the alarm would ignite into full-blown panic. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was a coordinated attack. Her hands would be shaking. Her carefully applied mask of serene superiority would crack. And in that moment of panic, she would do what she always did when things went wrong. She would call her husband. Not to ask what was happening, but to scream, to accuse. I could hear her voice in my head, high and shrill. "Marcus, your father is ruining everything. He's lost his mind. You need to fix this. Now." And that is when my own phone, which had been sitting dark and silent on the table beside me, finally came to life. The screen lit up, illuminating the name Marcus. It buzzed once, a harsh, angry vibration against the wood. Then it went silent. I did not move. I simply watched it. A few seconds later it buzzed again, and again. The chain reaction had reached me. The tremors had arrived, but I would not answer. Not yet. I would let them feel the ground shake beneath their feet for a little while longer. I could almost see it unfold as if watching a play from a distant seat. Ashley, a woman who prided herself on control, was now trapped in a rapidly collapsing house of cards. After her calls with the vendors, her first instinct would have been to seize back control. She would have called me, her voice dripping with that false saccharine sweetness she used when she wanted something, a tone that was meant to sound reasonable but was laced with the threat of a tantrum. "Theo, darling, there seems to be a little mix-up," she would have said. "Eleanor and Cynthia must have misunderstood you. Don't you worry, I'll handle it." But her call would have gone straight to the silence of my unanswered phone. She would have tried again and again. Each unanswered ring would have been a small chipping blow to her composure. Her next move would be to try and override my authority. She would call Eleanor Dubois back. "Eleanor, it's Ashley Coleman again," she'd say, her voice a little tighter this time. "I think my father-in-law is a bit confused today. Please go ahead with the original plans. I am authorizing it." But Eleanor, a woman of Lena's generation, understood loyalty and principle. "I'm sorry, Ashley." Eleanor would reply, her voice polite but firm as iron. "The contract is with Theodore. All payments were made by him. I can only take instructions from the client of record." Click. Ashley would stare at her phone in disbelief, her face flushing with rage. To be denied, to be told no by a mere event planner was an indignity she could not comprehend. She would then try Cynthia at Lena's kitchen, expecting a more pliable response from someone she viewed as a charity case. But she would be met with the same gentle, unshakable wall. "I'm so sorry, Ashley, but my arrangement is with Mr. Coleman. I hope you can understand." This is the point where her panic would truly set in. It wasn't just about the party anymore. It was about power. Her power, which she had always wielded so effortlessly over her husband, and by extension me, was suddenly gone. She was trapped, rendered impotent by the very man she had dismissed as irrelevant. The carefully constructed image of the perfect party, the perfect family, the perfect life, was crumbling into dust, and she was powerless to stop it. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated panic, her fear would metastasize into fury, a white-hot rage that needed a target. And the closest, safest target was always her husband. She would have found Marcus in his home office, probably trying to focus on some legal brief. She would have burst in her phone, gripped in her hand like a weapon, her face a mask of fury. "Your father has lost his mind," she would shriek, the words tumbling out in a torrent of rage. "He's sabotaging everything, everything. He's calling all the vendors, canceling the party, probably telling them we're destitute. He is humiliating me, Marcus. He is humiliating our daughter." She wouldn't mention the text message. She would frame this as an unprovoked act of senile madness. She would paint me as a spiteful old man lashing out for no reason, intentionally destroying Brianna's happiness. And Marcus, a man who had spent his entire marriage avoiding conflict, would be caught in the crossfire, looking from his wife's furious face to his own phone, where my name would be sitting silently among his recent calls. Ashley would have moved closer, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "I don't care what you have to do. I don't care if you have to go over there and threaten him. You will fix this. You will call your father and you will fix this. Now!" My phone, which had been sitting dark and silent on the table beside me, finally came to life. The screen lit up with a cold blue light illuminating the name Marcus. It buzzed once, a harsh, angry vibration against the wood, the sound of their panic given a voice. Then it went silent. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply sat in my armchair, the one Lena had always said was the most comfortable, and I watched it. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm, a calm counterpoint to the frantic energy I knew was pulsing on the other end of the line. A minute passed. It buzzed again. This time the call lasted longer, a desperate electronic plea. I could picture my son, his phone pressed to his ear, his wife's furious gaze boring into him from across the room. I could hear the chaos on the other end without even picking up the receiver. I could hear Ashley's voice, a ghostly echo in my mind, goading him, pressuring him, commanding him to fix the mess she had created. He would be stammering, trying to placate her while simultaneously trying to reach the father he had allowed her to disrespect. My son. A man of 40 with a law degree from Emory and a partnership at a prestigious firm. A man who commanded respect in a courtroom but had none in his own home. A man with the spine of a jellyfish. The phone fell silent again. Then almost immediately it began to ring once more. And again. And again. It became a relentless rhythm, the buzzing of a trapped insect against a window pane. It was the sound of a world losing its balance. For years they had been the ones in control. They had set the tempo of our family gatherings, dictated the terms of my involvement in their lives, managed my generosity as if it were a corporate asset. They had made me feel like a visitor in the family I had built. They had conducted the orchestra and I had simply played my part. But now I was the conductor. I was the one with the baton in my hand. And I had chosen silence. This was not cruelty. It was a lesson. A necessary education in the physics of cause and effect. They had pushed a button, and now they had to sit in the silence that followed. They had sent a text message believing it would have no consequences beyond their own convenience. They were now learning that every action creates a reaction. My silence was not passive. It was active. It was a vacuum into which all their anger, their panic, and their frustration was being forced to pour. I was letting them marinate in the consequences of their own choices. Let them call the vendors again. Let them face the polite, unyielding refusals. Let them feel the walls of their perfect, curated world closing in around them. Let them understand what it feels like to have no control. The phone continued its frantic dance on the table. 5 calls. 10. 15. I did not count. I simply observed. With each unanswered call, I knew their desperation was growing, their narrative of my senile confusion crumbling under the weight of my deliberate silence. This was not the act of a confused old man. This was the act of a king checking his opponent's queen. After the 20th call, the buzzing finally stopped. A profound silence descended upon the room once more. But it was different now. It was not the empty silence of loneliness. It was the charged electric silence between a flash of lightning and the inevitable roar of thunder. I knew this was not the end. It was merely the end of the first act. They had failed to reach me by phone. Now they would come here. The storm was on its way to my front door, and I would be ready. My phone continued its assault on the quiet of my apartment. The number of missed calls from Marcus climbed into the 20s, then the 30s. It was a relentless, desperate barrage. With each unanswered ring, I could feel the tenor of his panic shifting. The initial shock and confusion would now be hardening into anger. The anger of a man who is not used to being ignored. The anger of a man who is losing control and doesn't know why. I could picture him pacing the plush carpet of their living room, his face red, his jaw tight. He would be running his hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. He was a litigator, a man who built his career on his ability to command a room to bend people to his will through the force of his arguments. The irony was that his most formidable opponent was now his own father, armed with nothing more than silence. Ashley would be a circling shark, fueling his rage, feeding his panic. Did you get him yet? Why isn't he answering? Is he doing this on purpose? Every question would be an accusation, a jab at Marcus's inability to control his own father. She would not see this as a problem they had created, but as a failure on his part to manage me. In their world, I was an asset that had suddenly become a liability. My son, caught between his wife's escalating hysteria and my unyielding silence, would be feeling the pressure mount with every passing second. His anger wouldn't just be directed at me, it would be directed at himself, at his own powerlessness. He was used to solving problems. He was the man who made difficult situations go away. But how do you solve a problem that refuses to even speak to you? The number of missed calls passed 40. This was no longer just about the party. I knew that. For Marcus, this was now about authority, about the fundamental structure of our relationship. For his entire adult life, he had slowly, almost imperceptibly, taken on the role of the decision-maker. He advised me on my finances. He and Ashley had guided my decision to sell the house. They had assumed the mantle of leadership in the family. My silence was a direct, profound challenge to that assumed authority. It was a quiet declaration that the old order, the one where Theodore Coleman was the patriarch, was not as dead as they had believed. It was a reminder that I was not a child to be managed, but a man to be respected. 50 missed calls. The phone finally fell silent, its screen dark. The assault was over. The silence that filled the room now was different. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first volley has been fired. The air was thick with tension, with the promise of what was to come next. I knew Marcus. I knew the way his mind worked. When logic and persuasion failed, he would resort to presence. He would feel the need to confront the problem head-on, to stand in front of me and demand an explanation. They had tried to push me out of their lives with a text message. They had tried to pull me back in with a fusillade of phone calls. Both had failed. Now they would come here. They would bring the storm to my doorstep, and I would be sitting here in Lena's armchair waiting for the wind to blow the door down. The desperation had reached its peak. The next phase was confrontation, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt ready for it. While I sat in the quiet stillness of my apartment, a very different kind of silence would have fallen over my son's house. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating silence that follows an explosion when the air is thick with smoke and the ringing in your ears hasn't yet faded. The frantic energy of the phone calls would have subsided, replaced by the grim reality that their primary weapon pressure had failed. And in that vacuum, Ashley's panic would have completed its ugly transformation into pure, undiluted rage. She would have turned on Marcus, her eyes narrowed to slits, her face a mask of contempt. All the fear and humiliation she was feeling would be repackaged as blame and aimed squarely at him. 50 times, Marcus! She would have hissed, her voice low and venomous. You called him 50 times and he ignored you like you were a telemarketer. What does that say about you? What does that say about your own father's respect for you? She wouldn't have acknowledged the text message she sent. In her mind, that was a minor administrative detail, a simple act of social curation. My reaction was the real crime. My silence was the ultimate act of aggression. She would have started pacing their living room, her movements sharp and agitated like a caged animal. This is a disaster, an absolute unmitigated disaster, she'd say, her voice rising with every word. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? I have people flying in for this party. The invitations have been sent. The entire neighborhood is talking about it. And now what am I supposed to say? Sorry, my crazy, senile father-in-law decided to throw a tantrum and cancel everything. She would paint me as the villain, of course. That was always her way. She had a gift for crafting narratives where she was always the victim, always the one put upon, and long-suffering. She would twist my actions into an attack not just on the party, but on her, on Brianna, on the very fabric of their social standing. And Marcus, my son, the lawyer, the man who could dismantle a witness on the stand, would stand there and take it. He would absorb her fury like a sponge, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her accusations. His own anger towards me would be eclipsed by his fear of her. He would try to reason with her to calm her down. Ashley, let's just think for a minute. Maybe if we go over there. Go over there, she would have shrieked, cutting him off. We are past that point, Marcus. This isn't a negotiation. This is a hostage situation, and your father is holding our daughter's happiness, our reputation hostage. And you are just standing there letting it happen. She would have walked right up to him, invading his personal space, forcing him to meet her furious gaze. I have spent a year planning this. A year. I have poured my heart and soul into making this the perfect day for our daughter, and you are letting your father burn it all to the ground because you are too weak to stand up to him. The word weak would have been her final, most potent weapon. It was the one accusation he could never defend against because in his heart he knew it was true. His face would flush with a mixture of shame and anger, and in that moment he would have made his decision. Not out of a desire to solve the problem, but out of a desperate need to escape his wife's wrath. All right, he would have snapped, his voice tight with frustration. All right, I'll go over there and I will handle it. He would have grabbed his car keys from the table, not like a man on a mission, but like a soldier being sent on a suicide run he knew he could not survive. After what felt like an eternity, the phone rang one more time. The 51st call. I had let the pressure build to its absolute apex. I had allowed their panic to fester, to boil over into a frenzy. Now the time for silence was over. It was time for a single well-placed word. I did not rush. I let it ring 3 times, each shrill tone a punctuation mark in the story of their desperation. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt weighted with the significance of the moment, I reached over and lifted the receiver from its cradle. It felt cool and heavy in my hand, a solid piece of a world they no longer seemed to understand. The explosion of sound was instantaneous, exactly as I had predicted. It wasn't a greeting. It was an auditory assault, a torrent of rage and confusion. Dad, what the hell is going on? What are you doing? It was Marcus's voice, but it was a version I hadn't heard in years, stripped of its lawyerly composure, raw with a panic that bordered on hysteria. Ashley is losing her mind. Eleanor Dubois called, Cynthia called. They said you canceled everything. Everything. Is this some kind of joke? Are you sick? Did you forget to take your medication? You are ruining Brianna's party. You are ruining everything we have worked for. You are humiliating us. You have to call them back, Dad. You have to call them back right now and tell them it was a mistake. I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting the flood of his words wash over me without touching me. I listened. I listened not just to what he was saying, but to what he wasn't saying. There was no apology. There was no moment of self-reflection. There was no, Dad, Ashley told me what she texted you and I am so sorry. There was only blame. There was only panic about the party, about the logistics, about how they looked. He was not his own man. He was a mouthpiece for his wife's fury, a terrified ambassador sent to quell a rebellion. In his voice, I heard the frightened boy he used to be, desperate to please, desperate to avoid conflict. But now he wasn't trying to please me. He was trying to appease the tyrant in his own home. And in that moment, any lingering trace of doubt I might have had about my course of action vanished. It was replaced by a cold, hard certainty that was as solid and unshakable as granite. He had made his choice. He had chosen his wife's vanity over his father's dignity. I waited for him to finally run out of steam, for him to pause to take a ragged breath. The brief silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It was my turn. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his hysteria. I spoke calmly, my voice level and quiet, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a man delivering a final, unappealable verdict. Marcus, I said, the single word cutting through the static of his panic. I did exactly what you and your wife asked of me. I let the words hang in the air for a beat. I am not coming to the party. Another beat. I could almost hear his mind struggling to process the cold, inescapable logic of my statement. And neither is my money. I did not wait for his reply. I did not need to hear his sputtering disbelief, the dawning horror in his voice as the true meaning of my words landed. The conversation was over. The lesson had been delivered. With the same slow, deliberate motion with which I had picked up the phone, I placed the receiver back into its cradle. The soft, final click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a door being closed and locked, the sound of a bridge being burned, the sound of an old world ending and a new one beginning. On the other end of the line, there would have been a click, a sound as small as an insect's leg, snapping yet as final as a vault door swinging shut. Marcus would still be standing there, his own expensive smartphone pressed to his ear, listening to the dead, empty sound of the dial tone. His mouth would be slightly open, the angry words he had been about to shout dying in his throat. For a long, silent moment, he would not have moved. He was a statue of a man caught in mid-sentence. The words, my words, would be echoing in the sudden silence of his mind. I am not coming to the party. That was defiance. He might have expected that. But the second part, and neither is my money. That was not defiance. That was a verdict. That was the sound of a foundation cracking. It was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. The rage that had been boiling in his veins, the righteous, frantic anger fueled by his wife's hysteria, would have simply vanished. It would not have cooled. It would have evaporated, leaving behind a cold, empty space filled with a stunning, horrifying clarity. This was not a tantrum. This was not a senior moment. This was a calculated, strategic move. He had been outmaneuvered. He, Marcus Coleman, the brilliant litigator, had been checkmated by his own father in two simple, devastating sentences. Ashley would be watching him, her arms crossed her foot, tapping impatiently on the hardwood floor. Well, she would demand, her voice sharp, cutting through the haze of his shock. What did he say? Did you fix it? He wouldn't have an answer for her. He would slowly lower the phone from his ear, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at nothing. The fury was gone. The panic was gone. All that remained was a profound, bottomless sense of shock. He had gone into the call a furious, powerful lawyer ready to issue a demand. He had come out of it a stunned, disinherited son, who had just realized far too late that the quiet, unassuming old man he thought he could manage had been the one holding all the cards all along. It took them less than 20 minutes. I had just finished making myself a cup of tea. The slow, methodical ritual, a small act of defiance against the chaos I knew was careening towards me. I heard the squeal of tires as a car pulled into my apartment complex far too quickly. It was Marcus's BMW, a machine he drove with the same aggressive impatience with which he lived his life. Doors slammed, a discordant echo in the quiet afternoon. Then came the sound of their footsteps on the concrete walkway, hurried and heavy, a frantic drumbeat of approaching conflict. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to conquer. The knock on my door was not a polite request for entry. It was a barrage of sharp, angry raps, a demand. It was the sound of a man who had lost his patience and a woman who had lost her mind. I took a slow sip of my tea. It was chamomile, a scent that reminded me of Lena. She used to make it for me after a long day at work. The warmth of the mug in my hands was a small, solid anchor in the storm. I set the cup down gently on its saucer, making sure not to make a sound. I stood up, smoothed the front of my sweater, and walked to the door. I was not afraid. I was not angry. I felt a profound, almost unnerving sense of calm. This was not their battlefield. This was my home. I turned the deadbolt. The click was loud and final in the tense silence. I pulled the door inward, opening it wide, not just a crack. I would not cower. I stood in the doorway, framed by the familiar comfort of my own home, and I waited. And there they were, a portrait of modern misery. Marcus was in front, his face a mottled, unhealthy red. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie was loosened, and his hair, usually so perfectly coiffed, was a mess. He looked like a man who had just run a marathon he hadn't trained for. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fury and a desperate, pleading confusion. He looked like a little boy again, a boy who had broken something valuable and was about to face the consequences. Behind him, a half step to his left, was Ashley. She was the picture of cold reptilian rage. While my son looked like he was about to explode, she looked like she was about to strike. Her face was pale, her lips a thin, bloodless line. Her designer handbag was clutched in her hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes, however, were the most frightening part. They were not angry. They were dead, as cold and empty as a winter sky. They swept over me from my worn leather slippers to my calm, waiting face, and there was not an ounce of family feeling in them. It was the look of an auditor examining a discrepancy, the look of a predator sizing up its prey. We stood there for a long moment, the three of us locked in a silent tableau in the open doorway. The hallway of the apartment building behind them, my quiet, orderly living room behind me. They were standing on the threshold between their world of chaos and my world of order. And in that moment, I knew I had the advantage. They had come here expecting to find a confused, emotional old man they could bully and manipulate. They had come expecting to yell, to demand to issue ultimatums. They had come prepared for a fight. They were not prepared for the quiet, unshakable calm that met them at the door. I did not speak. I did not have to. I simply held their gaze, my expression unreadable, and I waited for them to make the first move. It was Ashley who broke the silence, of course. My son was still standing in the doorway, looking like a man who had just witnessed a car crash, his mind still trying to process the wreckage. But Ashley had no time for shock. Shock was a luxury she couldn't afford. She recovered with the speed of a predator, her cold, dead eyes narrowing into focused points of fury. She took a step forward, moving past her frozen husband and crossing the threshold into my apartment, into my home. She was a general taking the field. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" She began, her voice not a shout but a low, controlled hiss that was far more menacing. It was the sound of a snake before it strikes. Or are you so lost in your own selfish little world that you can't see the damage you're causing? She didn't wait for an answer. The questions were not questions. They were accusations fired like bullets. "This isn't about you. This is about your granddaughter. Your only granddaughter. This is her 18th birthday, a once-in-a-lifetime moment, a moment that we have been planning for over a year, a moment that you have just decided to burn to the ground out of what spite senility." She took another step into my living room, her expensive heels clicking sharply on my hardwood floors, an invasive, unwelcome sound. She waved her hand around the room, a gesture of dismissal. "You sit here in this museum surrounded by your old things, and you think you have the right to detonate a bomb in the middle of our lives." Brianna is devastated. Absolutely devastated. She has been in her room crying her eyes out for the last hour. Does that make you happy, Theo? Does it bring you some kind of sick pleasure to know that you made your own granddaughter cry on her birthday? It was a masterful performance. The concerned mother, the protector of her daughter's fragile happiness. She was weaving a narrative, a story in which she was the hero and I was the villain. The cruel, unfeeling old man who had inexplicably turned on his own family. And in her story, the inciting incident, her own cold, dismissive text message was completely erased. It simply didn't exist. According to her, my actions had occurred in a vacuum, a spontaneous act of malice. Marcus finally seemed to find his voice, though it was weak and unsteady. "Ashley, maybe we should just calm down." "Calm down," she wheeled on him, her voice lashing out like a whip. "Do not tell me to calm down, Marcus. Your father is systematically destroying our lives, and you want me to calm down. Why aren't you saying anything? Why are you just standing there? He is your father. Handle him." The contempt in her voice when she spoke to him was palpable. She turned her icy gaze back to me. "This is what this is about, isn't it, control? You're losing your grip, you're becoming irrelevant, so you pull a stunt like this to make yourself feel powerful again. Well, congratulations, Theo, you've succeeded. You've made everyone miserable. You've proven you can still throw a wrench in the works. Is that what you wanted? Are you proud of yourself now?" Throughout her entire tirade, I remained silent. I did not defend myself. I did not argue. I did not even change my expression. I simply stood there, my hands relaxed at my sides, and I watched her. My calmness was my shield, and it was a shield she could not penetrate. It was driving her insane. She was throwing every weapon she had at me, guilt, shame, accusation, and none of them were having any effect. Her verbal assault, which had been so effective in cowing her husband, was as useless against my silence as throwing pebbles against a fortress wall. I just let her words hang in the air between us, a toxic cloud of her own creation. I let her expose her own ugliness, her own desperation. And I let my son watch. I let him stand there in the doorway, a silent, ashamed witness to the character of the woman he had chosen over his own father. When Ashley finally paused, her chest heaving, her venom temporarily spent, the silence she left behind was thick and suffocating. My son Marcus looked from her to me, his face a mess of shame and helplessness. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He was a man adrift, his moral compass spinning wildly. I did not look at him. I did not even look at Ashley. Instead, I let my gaze travel slowly, deliberately past them to the far wall of my living room. I raised my hand not in a gesture of anger, but with a slow, almost reverent motion, and I pointed. "Do you see that woman?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the tense atmosphere with the clarity of a bell. It was not a question directed at either of them specifically, but to the room, to the memory that filled it. "That is my wife, Lena, your mother Marcus, the woman who gave you life, who sat up with you when you were sick, who taught you how to be a man." Ashley's eyes followed my finger, a flicker of annoyance on her face, as if this was some sentimental diversion from the real issue. Marcus, however, flinched as if I had struck him. His gaze fell upon his mother's portrait, and for the first time a look of genuine pain crossed his face. "You talk about this party," I continued, my voice still quiet, still calm. "You talk about a tent and flowers and a band. You talk about your daughter's happiness. But you don't seem to understand what you're talking about. You don't understand where those things came from." I lowered my hand and took a step back, creating more space between us, a symbolic representation of the chasm that had opened up in our family. "Do you remember the house you grew up in, Marcus? The one on Elm Street? The one with the big oak tree in the backyard that you and I built a tree house in? The one where your mother planted those rose bushes that she was so proud of?" I didn't wait for an answer. "Your mother and I bought that land with every penny we had. We built that house ourselves, nail by nail, board by board. We poured 40 years of our lives into those walls, 40 years of laughter, 40 years of arguments, 40 years of raising you. That house wasn't just a building. It was a living thing. It was the heart of our family. It was the story of our life together." I paused, letting the weight of those years settle in the room. Ashley was looking impatient, her arms crossed, tapping her foot. This history meant nothing to her. It was just an obstacle. But Marcus was listening. He was staring at the floor, his face pale. "Last year," I said, my voice dropping even lower, "you both convinced me to sell it. It was a practical decision," you said. "I was getting older. It was too much for one man to take care of. It was for my own good, and I listened to you." I looked directly at Marcus now, my gaze pinning him in place. "The money for this party, Ashley, the $22,500 for the tent, the orchids, the jazz band, the food, it did not come from a bank account. It did not come from my pension." I let the silence stretch, forcing them to lean into my next words. "It came from that house. It came from the sale of every brick your mother and I laid, every rosebush she planted, every memory we made within those walls. That money is not my money. It is Lena's. It is her final legacy. It is all that is left of the life she and I built together, and you were going to use it to throw a party that you had forbidden her husband from attending. You weren't just disrespecting me, you were spitting on the grave of your own mother. You were taking her memory, her legacy, and you were using it to celebrate your own selfish, petty, ungrateful world." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. For the first time since she had stormed into my apartment, Ashley was silent. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. My son Marcus looked as if he had been physically struck, his face ashen, his body swaying slightly as if he might fall. He had known, on some level, where the money came from, but he had never allowed himself to connect the dots, to feel the full crushing weight of what it represented. My words had forced him to see it, to feel it. "You accused me of destroying Brianna's future," I said, my voice still quiet, my gaze still locked on my son. "You screamed that I was selfish, that I was ruining her life out of spite. Let me tell you about the future I had planned for her. Let me tell you what was actually supposed to happen at that party." I walked over to the small antique desk that had been Lena's. I opened the top drawer and took out a long cream-colored envelope. It was sealed. I held it up so they could both see it. Your mother and I, we never had the luxury of a formal education, I said, my voice softening as I spoke of my wife. We built our lives on hard work and common sense, but Lena's biggest dream was to see her granddaughter walk across a graduation stage, a diploma in her hand with the whole world open to her. She wanted Brianna to have a start in life that we could only dream of, a start without the crushing weight of debt. Before she passed, she made me promise. Theo, she said, whatever is left from this house, you make sure it goes to that girl's future. You give her the foundation we never had. And I gave her my word. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. At the party after the cake was cut, I was going to get up and make a speech. I was going to talk about her grandmother. And then I was going to give this to Brianna. I looked back at them, my eyes moving from Marcus's stunned face to Ashley's, where a new expression was dawning, a tense, greedy curiosity. She was a predator who had just scented a much larger prize. The $22,500 was for one night, I said slowly, letting each word land with precision. It was for the tent and the flowers. It was for the vibe. It was an extravagant, foolish, but loving gesture. But it was never the real gift. It was just the wrapping paper. I held the envelope out slightly. This was the real gift. This was the future you accused me of destroying. This was the fulfillment of my promise to my dying wife. Ashley took an involuntary step forward, her eyes glued to the envelope. "What is that?" She breathed, her voice a dry whisper. I looked her directly in the eye, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying the force of a thunderclap in the silent room. "It's the rest of it," I said. "The rest of the money from the sale of Lena's house. A cashier's check made out to a trust fund in Brianna's name, $250,000. The number dropped into the room like a physical object. Marcus let out a choked, gasping sound. Ashley's face went completely white. The mask of the grieving mother of the outraged wife dissolved in an instant, replaced by the naked, ugly face of pure avarice that had just witnessed a fortune slip through its fingers. "It was for her college education," I continued, my voice mercilessly calm. 4 years debt-free at any university she chose. It was a foundation for her entire adult life. It was Lena's legacy given freely with love. It was supposed to be the greatest moment of her young life, a moment of pure joy and boundless possibility, a moment delivered by her loving grandfather. I paused, then delivered the final killing blow. "But you decided that a party without any old people was more important. You texted me and told me that my presence would ruin the vibe. So you see, I didn't cancel the gift. You did. You traded your daughter's $250,000 future for a party, and you didn't even get to keep the party." The silence that followed my final words was the most profound I have ever experienced. It was not an empty silence. It was a dense, heavy thing filled with the wreckage of their lies, their greed, and their profound, catastrophic miscalculation. It was the silence of a void, the vacuum left behind after a bomb has stolen all the air. Marcus was the first to break, but not with words. A sound escaped his lips, a choked, guttural noise that was part gasp, part sob. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, grayish white. He staggered back a step, his hand coming up to brace himself against the doorframe as if the very structure of the world had become unstable beneath his feet. His eyes, when they finally lifted to meet mine, were wide and glassy with a horror that went beyond the loss of money. It was the look of a man who has been forced to see his own soul in a mirror for the first time and is shattered by what he has seen. In his eyes I saw the full weight of his failure, not just as a husband who had been led by his wife, but as a son who had dishonored his mother's memory, as a father who had just single-handedly cost his daughter a future. The guilt was a physical force crushing him, stealing the very air from his lungs. He was drowning in it. Ashley, however, did not drown. She was made of something far colder, far more buoyant. For a single fleeting moment she shared in his shock. Her face went slack, her eyes wide, her perfectly painted lips parted in disbelief. The mask of the outraged wife, the defender of her daughter's happiness, simply dissolved. It didn't just crack, it turned to dust and blew away, revealing the raw, hungry face that had been lurking beneath it all along. And what was revealed was not a landscape of guilt or shame. It was a landscape of pure, bottomless avarice. As the number $250,000 settled in her mind, her shock did something extraordinary. It did not turn to remorse. It turned to energy, a frantic, predatory energy. Her eyes, which had been wide with shock, now narrowed. The focus of her gaze shifted from my face down to the cream-colored envelope still held loosely in my hand, and in that look I saw everything. The mask was gone, and the creature beneath was terrifying in its simplicity. It was a calculator. I could see the gears turning in her mind, the frantic computations running behind her eyes. It was no longer about the party or Brianna's feelings or my disrespect. It was about the money that had been there within her grasp and was now gone. Her shock was not the shock of a moral failing. It was the shock of a gambler who had just watched the jackpot slip through her fingers because she had bet on the wrong card. While my son was collapsing inward, crushed by the moral weight of his actions, his wife was already re-engaging with the world. Her posture subtly shifted. Her shoulders, which had been slumped in shock, squared slightly. A flicker of something hard and calculating entered her eyes. The victim was gone. The strategist was emerging. She was already working the angles, assessing the damage not to our family but to her financial future. And in that moment, the contrast between them was absolute. Marcus was lost in the past, haunted by the ghost of his mother and the shame of his own weakness. Ashley was already in the future, her mind a whirlwind of damage control and asset recovery. They were two separate species bound together by a marriage license but fundamentally different in their moral DNA. And I, the quiet, irrelevant old man, had done nothing but hold up a mirror, and the reflection had destroyed one of them and revealed the true monstrous nature of the other. I did not pick up the envelope from the desk. I left it there lying on the dark wood, a silent, powerful testament to everything they had lost. I turned my attention back to the two shattered people in my living room. To my son, who was now leaning heavily against the wall, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. And to my daughter-in-law, who was staring at the envelope with a look of such raw, primal hunger that it was almost pitiful. She looked like a starving wolf staring at a feast through a pane of unbreakable glass. "Get out," I said. My voice was not angry. It was not loud. It was the quiet, tired voice of a judge who has delivered his sentence and now wants the courtroom cleared. The words were a simple, flat command. Ashley's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a desperate last-ditch fury. "You can't do this," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. "That's Brianna's money. You can't just take it away. It's cruel. It's theft." A small, sad smile touched my lips. "It was never her money," I said softly. "It was a gift, and a gift, once it has been rejected, returns to the giver. You rejected the gift when you decided that my presence, my love, my very existence was an inconvenience that needed to be managed with a text message. You didn't want the man. You just wanted his money. Well, now you have neither." I looked past her to the trembling form of my son. I had one final thing to say, one final lesson to impart. "You are both parents," I said, my voice resonating with the quiet authority of my years. "You have a duty to teach your child about the world. You are supposed to teach her about character, about integrity, about respect, about the things that have real value." I let my gaze sweep over both of them, a final damning assessment. "Instead, you taught her a different lesson. You taught her that a grandmother's legacy is something to be liquidated for a party. You taught her that love can be transactional. And worst of all, you taught her that her grandfather's dignity is worth less than a vibe." I walked to the door and pulled it open, the invitation clear. "Now, please, leave my home." My final words, "leave my home," hung in the air, not as a shout, but as a quiet, unshakable pillar of fact. They had the weight of a physical force. It was that final, quiet command that finally broke through the paralysis that had gripped my son. Marcus lifted his head from his hands. His face was a wreck, ravaged by a shame so profound it seemed to have aged him 10 years in 10 minutes. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He looked at me, and in his gaze there was no fight left, no anger, only the devastating, bottomless acceptance of his own failure. He looked like a man who had just been handed a life sentence. He pushed himself off the wall, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The courtroom was adjourned. The verdict had been rendered. All that was left was the walk of shame. He turned and took a shambling step toward the open door, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. Ashley was still frozen in place, her mind still reeling from the financial blowback. She seemed to have been deaf to my final command. She was still staring at the envelope on the desk as if by sheer force of will she could make it fly into her hand. Marcus stopped beside her. He reached out and took her arm, not gently, but with a rough, desperate grip. It was the first decisive action I had seen him take all day. She flinched at his touch, her head snapping towards him, her eyes still wild with a mixture of greed and fury. "Don't touch me," she hissed. But for the first time her voice had lost its power. It was the empty hiss of a defanged snake. Marcus didn't even seem to hear her. He just pulled his face a grim, emotionless mask. He was a man on autopilot, his only remaining instinct, the need to escape the scene of his utter humiliation. He pulled her toward the door, dragging her out of my home like a piece of wreckage he was forced to salvage. She stumbled after him, her usual grace and poise completely gone. As she crossed the threshold, her head turned one last time, her eyes finding mine. If I had expected to see remorse or regret or even simple human sadness, I was mistaken. What I saw in her eyes was something far colder. It was the pure, unadulterated hatred of the vanquished, the look of a thwarted predator. It was a promise of future battles, a silent vow of revenge. I did not react. I simply held her gaze until she was gone, pulled out into the hallway by the ghost of the man who was my son. I watched them retreat, a broken, shuffling pair, a picture of moral and financial bankruptcy. They did not look back. I stood in the open doorway for a long moment, listening to their footsteps fade down the hall. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, I reached out and closed the door. The latch clicked into place, a sound of finality, of separation, of peace. The storm had passed, and I was finally, blessedly alone. After I closed the door, the quiet that filled my apartment was a fragile thing, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake. I knew the storm wasn't over. It had simply moved, relocating its destructive energy to my son's house. I could picture the drive back, the 20 minutes of suffocating silence inside that expensive German car. Marcus would be a hollow man driving on autopilot, his mind a chaotic replay of the last hour. He would be wrestling with the ghost of his mother, the shame of his weakness, and the staggering, unbelievable figure of $250,000. He would be a wreck, completely broken. She, on the other hand, would not be grieving. She would be calculating. The initial shock of the financial loss would have already been processed, filed away, and replaced by a cold, furious strategic reassessment. The mask of the victim was gone, but the mask of the loving mother was still a tool she could use. In fact, it was now her most powerful weapon. She knew Marcus was a lost cause, at least for now. He was drowning in his own guilt. But Brianna was a blank slate. Brianna was the key. Ashley had to get to her first. She had to control the narrative. I can see it as clearly as if I were there. They would walk into their sprawling, sterile home, and Brianna would come running down the grand staircase, her face bright with the innocent, self-absorbed excitement of a girl about to turn 18. "So how did it go? Did Grandpa like the final menu? Did you show him the pictures of the lighting?" She would see their faces, and her smile would falter. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" Before Marcus could even open his mouth, before his guilt could spill out in a torrent of truth, Ashley would have stepped forward, intercepting her daughter, her face a perfect tragic mask of maternal concern. "Oh, honey," she would have said, her voice trembling slightly, a masterful performance. "Something terrible has happened. Let's go sit down." She would have led Brianna to the sofa, shooting a warning glare at Marcus over her shoulder, a silent command to stay put and shut up. And then the lies would begin. A beautiful, meticulously crafted tapestry of deception. "Sweetheart," she'd start, taking Brianna's hands in her own. "Your grandfather, he's not well. He's been very confused lately, very angry. We think his age is starting to catch up with him." She would paint a picture of me not as a man who had been wronged, but as a pitiable, unstable old man lost in the fog of senility. She would tell Brianna that I had become paranoid, that I felt they didn't appreciate me enough, and that in a moment of spiteful confusion I had lashed out. "He's decided to cancel everything," Ashley would have said, perhaps even producing a single perfect tear. "He called all the vendors this afternoon, the tent, the caterer, the band, all of it. He's angry, and he's decided to take it out on you. He's punishing you, sweetheart, to get at me and your father." She would completely, utterly erase her own text message from the story. It would never be mentioned. In her version of reality, my actions were a spontaneous, cruel, and insane act of aggression against an innocent granddaughter. She would frame it as a tragedy, not a conflict. We tried to reason with him, honey. Your father and I just came from his apartment. We begged him. But he's just not himself. He's become cruel. And Brianna, who loved me but who had also spent 18 years under the powerful manipulative influence of her mother, would believe her. How could she not? The story was simple, it was tragic, and it made perfect logical sense if you didn't know the truth. Her young mind would be filled with a confusing mixture of pity for her senile grandfather and a burning righteous anger at the injustice of it all. She would see her party, her perfect night, her entire world being destroyed by the irrational whims of a confused old man. And in that moment my son would watch silent and broken as his wife turned his own daughter into a weapon, aiming her straight at my heart. It was less than an hour later that my phone rang again. I had been sitting in my armchair watching the afternoon light fade, not reading, not watching television, just sitting with the silence. When the phone buzzed on the side table, I didn't even have to look at the screen. I knew who it was. My heart, which had been a steady cold drum throughout the entire confrontation with Marcus and Ashley, now gave a painful fluttering lurch. This was the call I had been dreading. This was the part of the battle I knew I could not win. It was Brianna. I picked up the phone, my hand feeling heavy and old. I took a breath and answered. Hello. I didn't even get her name out before the dam of her adolescent anguish broke. Grandpa. It was her voice, but a version I had never heard before. It was thick with tears and ragged with an anger so profound it was almost unrecognizable. It was the sound of a heart breaking. How could you? She sobbed, the words a torrent of accusation. How could you do this to me, to me? What did I ever do to you? I tried to speak, to say her name, but she cut me off, a wave of rehearsed pain washing over me. Mom told me everything. She said you're not well. She said you're confused and angry and that you're taking it out on me. I didn't believe her at first. I told her no, not Grandpa, he would never hurt me. But you did. You did. Every word was a confirmation of my worst fears. I wasn't listening to my granddaughter. I was listening to a script. A poisonous, carefully crafted script written by her mother, and Brianna was just the unwilling actress forced to perform the part. This was my party, Grandpa, she cried, her voice cracking. My 18th birthday, the most important night of my life. I've been dreaming about it since I was a little girl. And you just destroyed it. You called everyone and you destroyed it. Why? Because you were mad at Mom and Dad. So you decided to punish me. You decided to ruin my life just to prove a point. The injustice in her voice was so real, so powerful, because she believed it. She believed the lie with every fiber of her being. Ashley had done her work well. She had taken my granddaughter's love and affection for me and twisted it into a weapon of righteous indignation. I hate you, she sobbed, the words finally tumbling out, the ones that had been designed to cause the most damage. I hate you for what you've done. You're a cruel, selfish old man, and I never want to see you again. I listened to it all in complete silence. I did not argue. I did not try to defend myself. What could I say? If I told her the truth that her mother had lied, that she had been manipulated, it would only sound like another attack, another act of cruelty from the confused old man in her mother's story. It would only drive her further away. Ashley had trapped me. She had made it so that any attempt to tell the truth would only validate her lies. So I stayed silent. I absorbed the blows. I let my granddaughter's pain, a pain manufactured by her own mother, wash over me. The real agony was not in the words she was saying. It was in the chilling realization that the sweet, intelligent girl I had bounced on my knee, the girl I had taught to fish, the girl whose laughter used to fill my old house with light, was gone. In her place was this stranger, a puppet, dancing on her mother's strings, her voice filled with a venom that was not her own. The silence on the line stretched as she cried, and in that silence, I grieved. I grieved for the loss of her innocence. I grieved for the loving relationship that had just been murdered. Are you even listening? She finally choked out. Do you even care? Brianna, I said, my voice quiet, heavy with a sadness I couldn't hide. I will always love you. It was the only truth I could offer her. It was the only thing I had left. But it wasn't what she wanted to hear. My love wasn't the issue. My perceived betrayal was. There was a sharp, angry sob on the other end of the line, and then a click. She had hung up. I slowly lowered the phone, the silence of my apartment rushing back in, colder and emptier than before. I had won the war with my son and his wife. But in the process, I had just suffered the most devastating loss of my entire life. While I sat in the wreckage of my relationship with my granddaughter, another more violent storm was breaking across town. I did not hear it, of course, but I could feel it. It was the sound of a dam breaking after a lifetime of pressure. Marcus, my son, had been a silent witness to it all. He had stood by while his wife sent her poison-laced text. He had stood by in my apartment, absorbing my words like a beaten man. And he had stood by as his wife fed their daughter a carefully constructed lie. But there is a breaking point for every man, even the weakest. And for Marcus, that breaking point was the sound of his own daughter's voice twisted by his wife's manipulation. He would have been standing in the hallway of his own home, a ghost in his own life, when Brianna slammed down the phone after her call with me. He would have seen her face streaked with tears, not of simple sadness, but of a righteous, burning anger. And he would have heard the words she was sobbing as she ran up the stairs to her room. "He's a cruel, selfish old man. I hate him." Those words, his wife's words coming from his daughter's mouth, were the spark that finally ignited the dry tinder of his soul. Something inside him, something that had been dormant for 15 years of marriage, finally snapped. He would have turned and walked into the living room where Ashley was sitting, probably scrolling through her phone, a small, triumphant smile on her face. She would have looked up, expecting to see the same defeated, broken man she had been married to for years. But the man who stood before her was someone else entirely. His face, which had been pale with shock, was now dark with a rage she had never seen. "What did you do?" he would have whispered, his voice dangerously quiet. Ashley, startled by his tone, would have put on her defensive mask. "What are you talking about? I was comforting our daughter after your father devastated her." "Don't you lie to me!" he would have roared, the sound exploding out of him, a lifetime of suppressed anger unleashed in a single moment. The force of it would have made her physically flinch. "I heard you, Ashley. I heard the story you told her. The story about the confused, angry old man. The story where you were the victim. You took your own daughter and you poisoned her. You poisoned her against her own grandfather." He would have been pacing now, a caged animal finally breaking free. "My father stood in his home and told us the truth about my mother's legacy, the truth about a $250,000 gift for our daughter's future, a gift you threw in the garbage because you didn't want an old person at your party. And then you came home and you looked our daughter in the eye and you fed her a fairy tale of lies." Ashley would have tried to fight back, to use her usual weapons of guilt and accusation. I was protecting her from him, from his cruelty. But her words would have been useless against the inferno of his rage. His cruelty. Marcus would have laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "My father has done nothing but give to us his entire life. He gave us the down payment for this house. He paid for my law school. He sold my mother's home, the last piece of her he had left, to give our daughter a future. And in return you sent him a text message that was so cruel, so disrespectful, it makes me sick to my stomach to even think about it. You didn't protect Brianna. You used her. You used her as a weapon to cover up your own disgusting greed and vanity." The fight would have raged the biggest of their marriage. It was no longer about me or the party. It was about everything. About a marriage built not on love but on control. About a man who had sold his soul for a quiet life. About a woman who saw her own family as assets to be managed. The foundation of their perfect life, the one they had curated so carefully, was cracking right down the middle. And as the sound of their shouting filled that big empty house, I knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The puppet had finally seen the strings. Upstairs in a room painted a shade of pink, I had always found too bright, another story was unfolding. The walls in that house are thin, a fact I know from years of holiday visits, of hearing the faint murmur of the television from the guest room. Tonight those thin walls would become the screen upon which the truth was projected. Brianna would have been lying on her bed, her face buried in a pillow, her body shaking with the sobs of a girl who believes her world has been unjustly shattered. She would be wrapped in the warm, comfortable blanket of her own righteous anger, grieving for the loss of her perfect party, the one her cruel grandfather had stolen from her. And then she would have heard it, not the usual muffled sounds of her parents' evening routine, but a roar of pure, unfiltered rage from her father, a sound so alien in their carefully controlled home that it must have felt like an earthquake. Curiosity, stronger even than grief, would have pulled her from her bed. She would have crept to her bedroom door, her heart pounding, and pressed her ear against the cool painted wood. At first, it would have been just a chaotic storm of noise, her mother's sharp defensive shrieks and her father's raw, broken shouts. But then, individual words, individual phrases would have started to cut through the noise, sharp and clear as shards of glass. My name. My father. She would have heard her own father choke out. And then a number. A number so large, so incomprehensible, it would have made no sense to her. $250,000, Ashley. $250,000. Brianna would have frowned, confused. What money? What was her dad talking about? Her mother's story had been about a confused, angry old man. There had been no mention of money. It didn't fit the narrative. And then came the next words from her father, words that would have sent a jolt of ice through her veins. You lied to her, Ashley. You looked our daughter in the eye and you lied. You told her he was senile. You told her he was cruel. You didn't tell her the truth. The lie. Her mother had lied. The thought would be so foreign, so impossible, that her mind would instinctively reject it. Her mother was her rock, her confidant, her fiercest defender. Her mother didn't lie. But her father's voice, raw with a pain she had never heard before, was impossible to ignore. And then the final devastating piece of the puzzle, a piece that had been deliberately hidden from her, fell into place. Because of a text message, her father screamed, his voice cracking with disbelief. You threw away our daughter's entire future because of a stupid, selfish text message. You told my father he wasn't welcome. You told him he would ruin the vibe. You did this. You! A text message. The vibe. The words would have echoed in her head, alien and yet vaguely familiar. The perfect solid ground of her anger, her grief, her righteous indignation would have begun to crack. The simple tragic story her mother had told her was suddenly complicated, ugly. A missing piece had just been slammed into place, and the picture it created was monstrous. Her grandfather wasn't a confused old man lashing out. He was a man who had been uninvited. Uninvited from a party he was paying for. A party that was meant to be the prelude to a life-changing gift. In that hallway, listening through the door, Brianna's tears would have stopped. The heat of her anger would have been replaced by a chilling, sickening cold. The world, which had seemed so simple just moments before, had suddenly become a dark and confusing place. The villain she had been crying over and the hero who had been comforting her had just switched places. It wasn't a full understanding, not yet. But it was the first terrifying hairline fracture in the foundation of her world. The first poison seed of doubt had been planted, and she was beginning to suspect that the truth was far, far uglier than she could ever have imagined. I did not know it at the time, of course. I sat in my quiet apartment grieving a loss I thought was permanent. But while I was lost in my own sorrow, the seeds of doubt that had been planted in my granddaughter's heart by the sound of her parents fighting began to sprout. I can only imagine what it must have been like for her, sitting in her room, a jury of one, listening to the two most important people in her life tear each other and the truth to shreds. The simple tragic story her mother had told her was now at war with the raw, undeniable pain in her father's voice. At some point, the need to find something solid, something real in the swirling chaos of lies and accusations must have become overwhelming. She would have gotten off her bed, her mind a numb and confusing landscape. She would have gone to her closet, to the top shelf, and pulled down an old shoebox. A box filled not with the curated, perfect images of her social media feed, but with the messy, tangible, and honest artifacts of her own past. Old photographs. Her fingers would have been trembling as she lifted the lid, and the first face she would have seen would have been mine. A younger version of me, smiling, holding a tiny 5-year-old Brianna up on my shoulders. She would have pulled it out, the glossy paper cool against her skin. And as she looked at it, a memory would have surfaced. A memory of a summer afternoon at the lake, the patient weight of my hand on her shoulder as I taught her how to cast a fishing line. The memory of my deep, rumbling laugh when she caught her first tiny sunfish and held it up like a trophy. Was that the face of a cruel man? She would have dug deeper. A picture of her grandmother Lena, her hands covered in flour, smiling at the camera as a 7-year-old Brianna stood on a stool beside her, carefully pressing a cookie cutter into a sheet of dough. The memory of the scent of cinnamon and melting butter would have filled her head. The memory of her grandmother's gentle hands guiding her own. The memory of the stories Lena used to tell her while they baked, stories of growing up poor but happy, stories where kindness was the most valuable currency in the world. Another photo, Brianna, age 12, in a slightly too big costume for a school play. And there I was sitting in the third row, the only grandfather in the audience, holding a small bouquet of flowers. She would remember the feeling of seeing me there, my proud, beaming face, a lighthouse in a sea of indifferent parents. She would remember how I had told her afterwards that she was a star, that her grandmother would have been so proud. She would have spread the photos out on her bed, creating a mosaic of her life, a life filled with my constant, unwavering presence, a life filled with my quiet, unconditional love. And then from downstairs, she would have heard her mother's sharp, accusatory shriek, followed by the broken, pleading sound of her father's voice. And the two realities could not coexist. The man in these photographs, the man who had been a constant source of warmth and stability in her life, could not be the same man her mother had described. One of them had to be a lie. The photos were the truth. They were undeniable proof. They were a consistent record of love and support that spanned her entire existence. The shouting downstairs, the talk of text messages and money and vibes, that was the lie. That was the alien element that didn't fit. And as she looked at my smiling face in a photograph from a long ago summer, the tears would have started to fall again. But these were not the hot, angry tears of a wronged teenager. They were the cold, bitter tears of a girl who was just beginning to understand the devastating scope of her own mother's deception. I had spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, hollow grief. The confrontation with my son and his wife had been a battle of wills, a necessary act of war. But the call from Brianna had been a different kind of wound. It was a deep, personal loss that left me feeling ancient and adrift. The silence in my apartment, which had once been a comfortable companion, now felt like a judgment. It was filled with the phantom echo of my granddaughter's voice, spitting the word I never thought I would hear from her lips: hate. I sat in my armchair, the old address book still open on the table beside me, a relic from a battle that had cost me far more than I had ever anticipated. It was nearly dusk when the phone rang again. My body tensed, a Pavlovian response to the electronic sound that had become a herald of pain. I expected it to be Marcus, perhaps calling to continue the fight, or Ashley with some new venomous line of attack. I almost let it ring. But a flicker of movement on the caller ID screen caught my eye. It was not a family member. The name displayed was Eleanor Dubois. My first instinct was confusion, followed by a wave of weariness. I assumed she was calling about the business end of the cancellation, perhaps about a contract clause I had overlooked. I steeled myself for another difficult conversation and answered the phone. Theodore Coleman speaking. "Theo, it's Eleanor." Her voice was soft, hesitant, completely devoid of the professional efficiency from our earlier call. "Forgive an old woman for meddling. I know you said it was a private family matter, and you have every right to tell me to mind my own business. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you all afternoon. I'm worried. I just had to call and make sure you were all right." Her words, so simple, so full of genuine human kindness, were completely disarming. It had been so long, even before this day, since anyone in my family had asked me if I was all right with such simple, honest concern. I'm all right, Eleanor," I managed to say, my own voice sounding rough and unfamiliar to my ears. "It's just been a difficult day." "I know it is," she said gently. "And I'm not calling to pry. I'm calling because it made me think of Lena." A fresh pang of grief went through me at the mention of my wife's name. "It reminded me of a time years ago at our bridge club," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a warm, reminiscent quality. "Do you remember that woman, Harriet Peterson? A bit of a gossip, always had something unkind to say. Well, one afternoon she was telling a particularly nasty story about another member who wasn't there to defend herself. The rest of us, myself included, I'm ashamed to say, just sat there in uncomfortable silence. But not Lena," Eleanor said, a smile in her voice. "Lena didn't say a word at first. She just quietly put her cards face down on the table. The little click of the cards on the wood made everyone stop talking and look at her. And she looked right at Harriet, not with anger, but with this incredible, sad disappointment. And she said, 'Harriet, is that really the kind of person you want to be? Is that the story you want to put out into the world?' She didn't raise her voice. But in that moment, she was the most powerful person in the room. Harriet was so ashamed she couldn't even speak. Lena never tolerated disrespect, Theo. Not of herself, not of her friends, not of a stranger. She believed a person's dignity was the most valuable thing they owned." I closed my eyes, a single hot tear escaping and tracing a path down my cheek. Eleanor's story was a gift. It was a message from the past, a validation from my wife delivered through her friend. It was a reminder that I was not just a bitter old man lashing out. I was defending the very principles Lena had lived by. I was being the man she had always counted on me to be. "Whatever is going on, Theo," Eleanor finished softly, "just know that you have friends who remember. We remember the man you are. We remember the incredible woman she was, and we respect you both." "Thank you, Eleanor," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Thank you, more than you know." When I hung up the phone, the silence in my apartment felt different. The echo of my granddaughter's hatred was still there, a painful ghost that would not leave easily. But it was no longer the only voice in the room. Now it was joined by the quiet, powerful echo of my wife's strength. I was not alone. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something that was not just resolve, but hope. The call with Eleanor had left a small, warm coal glowing in the cold emptiness of my chest. It wasn't enough to banish the chill, but it was a start. It was a reminder that the world was larger than the four walls of my son's house, that my life and Lena's had meant something to people, that our story was written in more hearts than just our own. I was still lost in that comforting thought when the phone rang again. This time I felt a flicker of apprehension rather than dread. The caller ID showed a number I didn't have saved, but the name beneath it was one I would never forget: Lena's Kitchen. My heart did a slow, painful turn. Cynthia. The young woman Lena had believed in. The last call with her had been the hardest, the lie I had told her the most bitter. I braced myself. Perhaps she was calling back with questions, her initial sympathy replaced by the practical concerns of a business owner. A $10,000 contract was not a small thing to lose. I answered, my voice quiet. "This is Theo Coleman." "Mr. Coleman, it's Cynthia." Her voice, usually so full of bright, bustling energy, was subdued, laced with the same gentle concern I had heard from Eleanor. "I am so sorry to bother you at home. I know you said there was a family emergency, and the last thing I want to do is intrude, but I got the official cancellation notice from my office, and, well, it just didn't sit right with me." "It's all right, Cynthia," I said, my voice weary. "The cancellation is correct. There's nothing more to it." "With all due respect, Mr. Coleman, I think there is," she said, and there was a sudden fierce loyalty in her voice that took me by surprise. "I'm not calling about the contract. Honestly, I've already told my staff to shred the invoice. That's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because your wife Lena gave me my life. That is not an exaggeration. She saw something in a broke, scared single mother that nobody else did, not even me. She didn't just give me money, Mr. Coleman. She gave me her time. She gave me her belief. The food in my kitchen comes from her recipes. The name on my door is her name. This business, it's as much hers as it is mine." I was silent, unable to speak, my throat tight with emotion. "The Coleman family doesn't cancel events because of emergencies," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The Colemans face emergencies head on. That's what you and Lena always did. And whatever's happening right now, whatever trouble has found its way to your door, it doesn't feel right that you should be facing it alone. Lena would never have stood for it, and I won't either." Her words were a declaration of allegiance. It was loyalty, pure and simple. A loyalty not bought with money, but earned through an act of kindness my wife had performed years ago. It was a loyalty that my own son, who had received a lifetime of such kindness, was incapable of showing. "So, I'm just calling to say this," Cynthia finished, her voice softening again. "I don't know what's going on, but if you need anything, and I mean anything at all, a hot meal delivered to your door, someone to run an errand, or just a friend to sit with you in the quiet so it's not so quiet, you call me. You don't ask, you call. That is not an offer, Mr. Coleman. That is a standing order from the owner of Lena's Kitchen." When the call ended, I sat there in the gathering dusk, my hands still on the receiver. The small, warm coal in my chest, the one Eleanor's call had ignited, was now a steady, growing flame. First Eleanor, then Cynthia. Two people from my past, two friends of my wife, reaching out not for personal gain, but out of simple, profound human decency. They were my allies. And in that moment I realized that I was not just a man on a mission of demolition. I was not just tearing something down. I was a man with friends. I was a man with a legacy to protect. And for the first time, a new thought began to form in my mind, not of destruction, but of construction. Not of an ending, but of a new beginning. I hung up the phone with Cynthia, the warmth from her words spreading through my chest like a slow-acting medicine. For the past several hours I had felt like a man adrift on a dark sea, my family having cut the rope that tethered me to shore. But now 2 lights had appeared in the distance. 2 lighthouses beaming messages of loyalty and respect from the coast of my past. Eleanor and Cynthia. They had not called asking for anything. They had called simply to offer their strength to remind me of the man I was and the woman my wife had been. Their loyalty offered so freely stood in stark, painful contrast to the transactional nature of my own family's affection. My son and his wife saw me as a bank. These women, bound to me only by the fading threads of memory and friendship, saw me as a man. I sat there in the encroaching darkness, the lamp on my side table casting a small golden pool of light in the room. In that circle of light lay the tools of my recent war, the stack of canceled invoices, the old worn address book, and the telephone. I looked at the invoices. Magnolia Events, Lena's Kitchen, the midnight train. I had seen them as pillars of a structure I needed to demolish, a structure of vanity and disrespect, and I had succeeded. I had brought the whole thing crashing down. But now in the quiet aftermath, I saw them differently. They weren't just line items on a budget. They were people. People who respected me, people who loved my wife. They were not my enemies, they were my allies. And then a new thought, quiet and revolutionary, began to form in the back of my mind. It was the way an engineering problem sometimes solves itself in a dream. You stare at the blueprints for so long you can't see the solution, and then when you finally rest, the answer appears elegant and simple. What if my goal was not demolition? What if it was repurposing? I had designed my response as an act of destruction, a way to punish their disrespect by taking away the thing they wanted. But what if there was a better way? A way that was not about ending something, but about beginning something else. A way that was not about honoring their petty desires, but about truly honoring Lena's legacy. My eyes fell on the cream-colored envelope still sitting on Lena's desk, the $250,000. The scholarship fund I had intended for Brianna. My promise to Lena had been to secure her granddaughter's future, but my wife's dream had always been bigger than just one person. She had believed in community. She had believed in lifting people up. Brianna, in her current state, poisoned by her mother's values, would not have appreciated the gift for what it was. She would have seen it as a number in a bank account. She would not have understood the sacrifice, the love, the history that it represented. To give it to her now would be like planting a seed in barren soil. And that's when the pieces clicked into place. The vendors, the money, the date. It all formed a new blueprint in my mind. A plan so much more elegant, so much more powerful than simple cancellation. It was a plan that would not only punish the guilty, but would also reward the worthy. It was a plan that would turn an instrument of their vanity into a monument to my wife's generosity. I would not cancel the party. I would transform it. I would rehire every single vendor. The tent from Eleanor, the food from Cynthia, the music from Ray. But the guest list would be different. The purpose would be different. It would not be a birthday party for one privileged, ungrateful girl. It would be an inaugural fundraising gala. It would be the official launch of the Lena Coleman Educational Foundation, a charity dedicated to providing college scholarships to underprivileged, high-achieving students from our community. A slow smile spread across my face for the first time that day. It was a perfect, beautiful, and devastatingly effective plan. Ashley wanted a party to impress her friends and climb the social ladder. I would give her one. She would be forced to attend one where she would have to sit and watch as the money she coveted was given away to strangers, all while the entire community applauded the generosity of the man she had tried to erase. It was not just revenge. It was a statement. It was a re-establishment of the values my wife and I had lived by. I would not be the cruel, senile old man from her pathetic story. I would be the pillar of the community, the loving husband honoring his wife's memory in the most public and powerful way imaginable. My grief and my anger melted away, replaced by the clean, cold thrill of a perfect design. I reached for the phone, my hand no longer trembling. I knew exactly who to call first. The blueprint was complete. The legal pad in front of me was no longer a collection of angry thoughts. It was a schematic for the restoration of honor. I had a venue in mind, a guest list that was an army, and a purpose that was as unshakable as the foundations of the bridges I used to build. I had repurposed my anger into a powerful new design. Now it was time to break ground. I picked up the phone and dialed Eleanor Dubois' number for the second time that day. This would not be a call of cancellation. This was a call to action. "Theo," she answered, her voice still laced with concern from our last conversation. "Eleanor," I said, my voice clear and steady, infused with a new energy that surprised even me. "I have a proposal for you. I want to hire you back. I want you to call Cynthia and Ray and hire them back too. Full fee, not a penny less." "Hire us back for what?" she asked, her confusion evident. "For the event on Saturday," I said. "But it's no longer a birthday party. It's the first annual fundraising gala for the Lena Coleman Educational Foundation." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could almost hear her mind racing, trying to assemble the pieces. "Theo," she finally whispered, That's wonderful. That's just the beginning," I said, leaning forward in my chair, my voice dropping with the weight of my next words. "I am launching the foundation with an initial endowment of $250,000, and that is what I want you to put on the invitation. But here is the real proposal, Eleanor. Here is the centerpiece of the evening. I will also be announcing that I will personally match every single dollar raised at the gala up to another $250,000. I heard a sharp intake of breath. She understood immediately. This wasn't just a charity launch. It was a public challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of my son and daughter-in-law's entire social circle. "My God, Theo," she breathed, a note of pure awe in her voice. "You're not just building a foundation, you're building a legend." I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "Consider me your general contractor," she said, her voice now buzzing with excitement. "This is the kind of story Lena would have loved, and we are going to tell it perfectly." The week that followed was a blur of controlled, focused activity. The quiet of my apartment, which had been a vessel for my grief and then my anger, was now transformed into a command center, a war room for a campaign of philanthropic retribution. Eleanor Dubois was my general, and she was magnificent. She moved with the speed and precision of a seasoned commander, her initial shock at my plan quickly evolving into a fierce, joyful determination. Our daily phone calls, once a source of dread for me, now became the strategic highlight of my day. "All right, Theo, update," she'd say, her voice crackling with an energy that defied her age. "I've secured the main ballroom at the Four Seasons in Midtown. It's elegant, it's prestigious, and more importantly, it was available. I had to call in a favor from a friend on their board, but when I told her it was for an event in Lena's name, she moved mountains. The change of venue was critical. It elevated the event from a backyard family affair into a major social and philanthropic occasion. It took it out of the realm of their control and placed it firmly in the heart of the city's elite. A backyard party can be dismissed as a family squabble. A gala at the Four Seasons is a public statement. Next came the vendors. I had given Eleanor the list, and she executed the calls with relish. She called Cynthia at Lena's kitchen first. "Cynthia, my dear, it's Eleanor Dubois," she would have said. "It seems there has been a wonderful change of plans. Mr. Coleman isn't canceling, he's upgrading. We are no longer having a small party. We are hosting the inaugural gala for the Lena Coleman Educational Foundation at the Four Seasons, and we would be honored if you would cater it." I could imagine Cynthia's stunned silence, followed by a whoop of pure joy. It wasn't just business for her. It was a vindication of Lena's belief in her. She made a similar call to Ray from the midnight train. The band wasn't just a gig anymore. They were the featured entertainment at a high-profile charity event. They were no longer just playing for a teenage birthday party. They were providing the soundtrack for an act of legacy building. Every vendor I had canceled was rehired, their contracts reinstated at the full price. This was important. My plan was not about saving money. It was about reallocating it, transforming it from a symbol of their vanity into a symbol of my wife's generosity. While Eleanor handled the logistics, I worked on the guest list. I sat at Lena's desk with my old address book, a pot of fresh coffee at my elbow, and I meticulously crafted my army of witnesses. It was a delicate process. I needed more than just numbers. I needed influence. I listed judges, doctors, university professors, and the CEOs of companies I had worked with over the years. People of substance. People whose respect could not be bought. People who would understand the quiet, powerful statement I was about to make. With each name I added to the list, I felt a piece of my own history, my own dignity being reclaimed. I was reassembling my world, a world built not on the flimsy foundation of social media vibes, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect and shared history. This event was becoming more than just a countermove in a family feud. It was becoming a testament to a life well lived. It was a celebration of the values Lena and I had cherished. And every detail from the ballroom to the band to the guest list was a carefully chosen weapon in the quiet, elegant war for my family's soul. 2 days later, a courier delivered a heavy, elegant box to my apartment. Inside was the finished product of Eleanor's whirlwind of activity, the invitations. I lifted one from the box. It was nothing like the brightly colored festive card that had been chosen for Brianna's original party. This was different. The cardstock was thick and creamy, the color of old ivory. The text was not printed in a playful script, but engraved in a classic, dignified font, the ink a deep charcoal gray. It felt substantial in my hand. It felt important. It spoke of legacy, of seriousness of wealth, not as a plaything, but as a responsibility. I read the words that Eleanor and I had so carefully crafted. They were simple, direct, and devastatingly effective. You are cordially invited to attend the inaugural gala celebrating the launch of the Lena Coleman Educational Foundation. Below that, in smaller, elegant script, was the mission statement, an evening dedicated to creating opportunities for the next generation of community leaders. And beneath that, the keynote information: the foundation will be launched with an initial endowment of $250,000 from its founder, Theodore Coleman, in honor of his beloved wife, Lena. The date, the time, and the new, prestigious venue, the Four Seasons Ballroom, were listed at the bottom. There was no mention of a birthday, no mention of Brianna. My granddaughter had been completely and surgically removed from the narrative. The event that she believed was hers, the night that was supposed to be all about her, had been repurposed, its very DNA rewritten. It was now a public testament to the woman whose memory her parents had so casually disrespected. The invitations were weapons, each one a silent missile aimed at the heart of their social world, carrying a payload of undeniable truth. Eleanor's team worked with quiet efficiency. Over the next few hours, couriers were dispatched all over the city. An invitation went to Judge Henderson, who had served on a community board with Lena. Another went to Dr. Evans, the head of cardiology at Emory, a man I had known for 30 years. They went to business owners, to university deans, to old friends from our neighborhood on Elm Street who had watched Marcus grow up. They went to the pillars of our community, the men and women whose opinions mattered, whose presence at an event conferred instant legitimacy and importance. With every invitation that left my apartment, I felt like I was rebuilding a wall around myself, a wall made not of bricks and mortar, but of the respect and goodwill Lena and I had spent a lifetime building. Finally, there was only one invitation left in the box. It sat alone on my dining table, a single creamy white rectangle. The envelope was addressed in Eleanor's beautiful calligraphy to Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Coleman. This was the final move in this stage of the game. It was not a request. It was a summons. It was a beautifully crafted, socially binding subpoena. I had created a trap from which there was no easy escape. If they didn't attend, they would be snubbed by the very people they were so desperate to impress. Their absence would be a public admission of a family rift, a story they could not control. But if they did attend, they would be forced to sit there smiling, surrounded by our entire world, and applaud as I dismantled their lies piece by piece. They would have to watch as I became the hero of a story in which they had tried to cast me as the villain. I picked up the final envelope. My hand was steady. I sealed it, the faint taste of the adhesive, a strange final communion with my plan. The trap was set. All that was left was to wait for my prey to walk into it. The days that followed our confrontation were, I imagine, a time of cold, silent warfare in my son's house. The explosion of Marcus's rage would have eventually burned itself out, leaving behind the toxic ash of unspoken resentments. They would have moved through their large, beautiful home like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, the silence between them thick with all the things they could no longer say to each other. The party was gone. The money was gone. All that was left was the bitter taste of their shared failure. It was into this fragile, poisoned piece that the mail was delivered on a Wednesday afternoon. It would have been Ashley who retrieved it. Managing their social calendar, their public image was her domain. She would have sorted through the usual collection of bills and glossy catalogs with a sense of weary disdain, her life's pleasures now feeling like a mockery. And then she would have seen it. A single cream-colored envelope, heavy and thick, standing out from the junk mail like a diamond in a pile of gravel. Her name and Marcus's were written on the front in elegant looping calligraphy. It was a piece of mail that announced its own importance before it was even opened. Her first thought might have been a flicker of hope. Perhaps it was a belated birthday gift for Brianna from a wealthy friend, a sign that her social world was still intact. She would have carried it into the house, perhaps to the granite island in her kitchen, and slid it open with a silver letter opener. She would have slid the thick card from its envelope. And then she would have read the words. I can picture the sequence of expressions on her face as she processed the information. First, confusion. The Lena Coleman Educational Foundation. The name would have been a complete non sequitur. She would have read it again, her brow furrowed. Then the date would have registered. This coming Saturday, the date of the party. The confusion would have morphed into a dawning, sickening sense of dread. And then she would have seen the venue, the Four Seasons Ballroom. This was not some mistake. This was a declaration. Marcus would have walked into the kitchen at that moment, drawn by her stillness. What is it? He'd ask, his voice flat and tired. She wouldn't have answered. She would have simply handed him the card. He would have taken it, his eyes scanning the engraved text. I can see his hands beginning to tremble. I can see the last vestiges of color draining from his face. He would have read about the inaugural gala, about the foundation being launched in his mother's name, and then he would have seen the number printed in elegant, undeniable script. An initial endowment of $250,000. It was a confirmation of his worst fears, a public announcement of their private humiliation. The money was not just gone. It had been repurposed, transformed into a monument to his own failure as a son. It was a gravestone for the respect he had lost. He and Ashley would have looked at each other, then the Cold War between them forgotten, replaced by a shared unifying shock. They had thought the battle was over. They had thought they were just dealing with the quiet, sullen aftermath of a family argument. They had just realized in that horrifying moment that my silence had not been a retreat. It had been a preparation. It had been the quiet before a storm so much larger, so much more public, and so much more humiliating than they could ever have imagined. Their faces would have been identical masks of pale, bloodless shock. They hadn't just lost the battle. They had just found out that they had been fighting on the wrong map entirely. The shock would have held them in its icy grip for a long time, the elegant cream-colored card feeling as heavy as a tombstone in their hands. But eventually the paralysis would have receded, replaced by the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. It would have been Ashley who recovered first. Her mind, a finely tuned machine for social strategy and damage control, would have rebooted, kicking into overdrive. The shock was a luxury she could no longer afford. Now it was time for analysis. All right. She would have said, her voice a low, tight whisper, the sound of a spring being wound to its breaking point. Think, we need to think. She would have begun pacing the length of their cavernous kitchen, her initial pallor replaced by 2 feverish, angry spots on her cheeks. Marcus would still be standing by the counter, looking at the invitation as if it were a venomous snake he was afraid to touch. Think about what, he would have mumbled, his voice a hollow echo of his former self. Ashley, it's over. He won. Don't you dare say that. She would have snapped, her eyes flashing with a desperate fire. It is not over until I say it's over. Now what are our options? She was a general trying to find an escape route from a battlefield where she was surrounded. She would have started mapping out the terrain of their social world, a world that now felt like a minefield. Option 1, she'd say, holding up a manicured finger. We don't go. We claim we have a prior engagement. We feign illness. We simply ignore it. Marcus would have looked up, a flicker of hope in his dead eyes. Yes, he'd say. We don't have to go. We can just not go. And what happens then, you idiot? She would have spat, her voice dripping with contempt for his naivete. Think it through. The entire city will be there. Judge Henderson, the Evanses, our neighbors, everyone we have spent the last 10 years trying to impress, and the guest of honor's own son and daughter-in-law are nowhere to be found. What do you think the story will be? People will talk. They will ask questions. And your father, in his new role as the benevolent, grieving philanthropist, will answer them. He'll be so sad, so disappointed, he'll hint at a private family matter. He won't have to say a word against us. The whole world will fill in the blanks. And the story they will tell is that we are the cruel, ungrateful children who abandoned the noble old man in his time of need. It would be social suicide. We would be pariahs. The flicker of hope in Marcus's eyes would have died. She was right. He knew it. Not attending was not an option. It was a public execution. "So what then?" he would have whispered. "Option 2, Ashley would say, her voice grim. She would have stopped her pacing and looked at him, her eyes as hard as diamonds. "We go." The words would have hung in the air between them, ugly and terrifying. "We go," she would repeat, as if trying to convince herself. "We put on our best clothes. We plaster smiles on our faces. We walk into that ballroom with our heads held high. We play the part, the proud son, the supportive daughter-in-law. We applaud his speech. We praise his generosity. We shake hands and we tell everyone how wonderful it is that he is honoring Lena's memory in this way." She was describing a specific kind of hell, a hell of public performance of forced hypocrisy, a hell where they would have to be willing participants in their own humiliation. "We can't," Marcus would have choked out. "Ashley, I can't. I can't stand in that room and watch him do this. I can't look those people in the eye." "You will," she would have hissed, her voice a blade of ice. "You will, because it is the only move we have left. We either die a quick death by not showing up, or we die a slow, painful one by being there. At least if we are there, we have a chance, however small, to manage the narrative, to whisper our own version of the story. But if we are not there, we have no voice at all. He controls everything." And in that moment, the true, perfect, inescapable nature of my trap would have become clear to them. It was a checkmate. Every possible move they could make led to their own destruction. They were trapped not by walls or by chains, but by the intricate, invisible web of their own social ambition. My father, the quiet, gentle man they had dismissed as a relic, had built a cage for them out of their own vanity, and they had walked right into it. They had no choice. The invitation was not an invitation, it was a sentence. And on Saturday night, they would have to appear in court to hear it read aloud to the entire world. I did not need to be in the room to hear the argument that followed. I know my son. And after our confrontation in my apartment, I now knew his wife with a chilling clarity. The shock of receiving the invitation would have been the catalyst, the spark that ignited the poisonous gas that had been filling their home for days. But this fight, their final, most devastating fight, would not have been about the logistics of the gala. It would not have been about what to wear or what to say. It would have been a bitter, brutal autopsy of their marriage, with the blame for its death laid bare on the cold granite countertop between them. It would have started with Marcus, his voice a low, broken thing filled with the despair of a man who knows he is damned. "This is it, then," he would have mumbled, staring at the invitation. "This is how it ends. He's going to stand up in front of the whole world and humiliate us, and we have to just sit there and take it." Ashley, her mind still racing with strategic calculations, would have had no patience for his self-pity. "Oh, stop it, Marcus," she would have snapped. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself. We wouldn't be in this position if you had been a man and handled your father years ago." And that would have been the trigger. The accusation of weakness, the one charge he knew to be true, would have finally broken the dam of his shame. "Me!" he would have roared, the sound shocking in its raw power. "You want to talk about who is responsible for this? This started with you, Ashley. It started with a single, cowardly, unbelievably stupid text message. You didn't have the courage to pick up the phone. You didn't have the decency to have a real conversation. You tried to dismiss my father, a 75-year-old man, like he was a piece of junk mail. This entire catastrophe, every last humiliating second of it, is because of you." Her response would have been swift and vicious, a cornered animal lashing out. "Don't you dare try to pin this on me. A real man would have had his family in order. A real man would have set boundaries with his aging, emotional father. But you were always too scared of him, too scared to tell him no, too weak to stand up for your own wife. I had to be the one to do the dirty work because you were too much of a coward to do it yourself." "The dirty work?" He would have laughed, a raw, ugly, heartbroken sound. "You call costing our daughter $250,000 the dirty work he was going to give her a future, Ashley? A future free of debt? A foundation for her entire life. And you traded it all for a vibe. You traded it for the approval of a bunch of shallow 18-year-old kids. Was it worth it, Ashley? Was the vibe worth $250,000? You didn't know about the money either," she would have screamed, her voice cracking. "So don't you stand there and act so morally superior. You were just as shocked as I was. The only difference between us, Marcus, is that when I get knocked down, I get back up and I fight. You just lie there and cry about it." That is when the final, deepest truth would have come out of him, a confession that had been buried for years. This was never about the money for me, he would have whispered, his rage finally breaking, leaving only a vast empty landscape of pain. This was about my mother. It was her legacy. It was her home. You never respected her, Ashley. You always saw her as this folksy, unsophisticated woman who didn't fit into your perfect, curated world. You tolerated her, you never loved her, and you took the last beautiful thing she had to give and you treated it like it was nothing. You didn't just disrespect my father, you disrespected her memory, and I stood by and I let you do it. For years, I let you do it. The silence that followed that confession would have been absolute. He had finally named the sin. Not just the sin of this one week, but the sin of their entire marriage. It was all out in the open now, ugly and unforgivable. They were no longer a team engaged in damage control. They were two strangers staring at each other across the ruins of a life they had built on a foundation of lies. They would still go to the gala, but they would not go together. They would go as two separate, defeated individuals trapped in the same car on their way to their own public execution. The fight would have died eventually, not in a moment of understanding or reconciliation, but in the way a fire dies when it has consumed everything there is to burn. The shouting would have subsided, leaving behind the toxic ashes of their anger and the cold, hard ruins of their marriage. I imagine them in their cavernous living room, separated by a chasm of silence, the beautifully engraved invitation sitting on the table between them like a ticking bomb. Marcus would be a hollowed-out man slumped in a chair. All the fight had gone out of him, leaving only a vast, empty landscape of shame. But Ashley would not be broken. She was a survivor. Her grief was not for the loss of her marriage, but for the loss of her social standing, a loss she would fight to the bitter end to prevent. She would have been the first to speak, her voice no longer hysterical, but flat, devoid of emotion, like a military strategist assessing a catastrophic defeat. So, she would have said, her voice cutting through the silence, we have destroyed each other. The question now is whether we allow your father to destroy what's left of our public lives. Marcus would not have looked at her. He would have just stared at the floor, shaking his head slowly. I can't go, Ashley, he would have whispered, his voice the raw, broken sound of a man who has surrendered. I can't. I can't sit in that room and watch him. I can't look him in the eye. I can't look anyone in the eye after this. It's over. No, she would have said, her voice as hard and cold as the granite countertop she was leaning against. It is not over. Don't you understand? Your feelings are irrelevant now. My feelings are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is survival. And right now we are in a battle for our social survival. She would have walked over to stand in front of him, forcing him to look up at her. We have a choice between two humiliations, Marcus. A quiet, mysterious humiliation where we disappear and we let everyone in that room, our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, invent their own story about why we aren't there. A story where your father is a saint and we are the villains. Or we have a loud public humiliation that we attend, and that we can at least try to survive. Survive? He would have choked out a bitter, humorless laugh escaping his lips. He's going to stand up on that stage and execute us in front of the entire city. Yes, she would have said, her eyes boring into his. He is, and we are going to sit there and we are going to watch, and we are going to smile. We will be the proud son and the loving daughter-in-law. We will applaud his speech. We will shake every hand. We will praise his generosity. We will perform the role of our lives. Because if we are there, we are part of the story. We can talk to people. We can hint that there's more to it than meets the eye. We can plant seeds of doubt. But if we are not there, we are nothing. We are just the subject of gossip. He wins completely. Is that what you want? Marcus, do you want to hand him a total, unconditional victory? He would have looked at her, at the desperate, brilliant, terrifying strategist he had married. He would have seen the logic in her words, the cold, brutal truth of their situation. It was not a choice between honor and dishonor. Honor had already been lost. It was a choice between annihilation and a desperate, clinging fight for relevance. And for a man like Marcus and a woman like Ashley, annihilation was unthinkable. He would not have said yes. He would not have agreed. He would have simply let the silence be his answer. It was not a truce. It was an armistice. A temporary cessation of hostilities in the face of a greater common enemy. The war between them would resume later, but on Saturday night they had a performance to give. For the sake of their reputation, for the sake of the life they had so carefully built, for the simple primal need to save face, they would go. They would walk into the lion's den together, not as husband and wife, but as two co-conspirators in the desperate act of saving themselves. On the evening of the gala, the city of Atlanta seemed to hold its breath. A cool, clear autumn night had descended the sky, a deep, star-dusted velvet. In my small, quiet apartment, I began to prepare. This was not the hurried, anxious preparation of a man going into battle. It was a slow, deliberate ritual, a ceremony of one. I opened my closet and took out the suit I had not worn in 5 years. It was a deep, charcoal gray, the wool soft and heavy. I had worn it on my 50th wedding anniversary, the night Lena and I had renewed our vows in front of our friends and family in the backyard of the house that was now gone. Putting on the suit felt like putting on armor. But it was not the armor of a warrior. It was the armor of a king, a patriarch, a man secure in his own history. I tied my tie, a dark silk one that Lena had given me for my 70th birthday. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time I did not see an old man. I saw a man of substance. I saw a husband. I saw a father. I saw Theodore Coleman. My face was calm. My hands were steady. I was not nervous. I was ready. My purpose was as clear and solid as the foundations of the bridges I had spent my life designing. I was not going to a party to humiliate my son. I was going to a gala to honor my wife. And in the quiet dignity of that act, their humiliation was simply an unavoidable, unfortunate byproduct. Across town, in a house 5 times the size of my apartment, another ritual of preparation was taking place. But it was a ritual of a very different kind. There would have been no conversation. The silence in that house would not have been peaceful. It would have been a dense, heavy thing, filled with the shrap-rapnel of their last brutal argument. It was the silence of 2 soldiers in a foxhole who have come to hate each other more than they hate the enemy. Ashley would be in her massive walk-in closet, a room larger than my own living room. She would be selecting her dress with the cold, strategic precision of a general choosing her weapons. It would be something stunning, something expensive, something designed to project an image of unshakable confidence and effortless grace. Her makeup would be a flawless mask, a perfect, beautiful lie designed to hide the frantic, desperate calculations whirring behind her eyes. Every movement she made would be precise, mechanical, devoid of joy. She was not dressing for a celebration. She was arming herself for a public execution, hoping that a dazzling enough shield might deflect the blade. And Marcus, my son, would be a ghost in his own home. He would be in their bedroom knotting his tie with numb, fumbling fingers, his eyes staring blankly at his own reflection in the mirror. He would not see a powerful lawyer. He would see a failure, a hollow man. He would not be angry anymore. The rage had burned out, leaving only the cold, dead ash of shame. He would be moving through the motions, a condemned man being dressed for his own hanging. They would move around each other in the vast spaces of their home, not speaking, not touching 2 planets in a cold, dead solar system. Their orbits fixed, their atmospheres unbreathable. The opulence that surrounded them, the marble floors, the designer furniture, the abstract art would serve only as a mocking testament to their emotional bankruptcy. They were a king and queen of a ruined kingdom preparing to preside over its final public collapse. The ballroom at the Four Seasons was a world away from the cold, sterile luxury of my son's house. Eleanor had outdone herself. The vast room was not opulent in a gaudy way. It was a picture of understated old-money elegance. The lighting was soft and golden, casting a warm, intimate glow on the dozens of round tables draped in crisp white linen. In the center of each table was a simple, beautiful arrangement of white orchids, the same flowers I had ordered for the original party, now repurposed as a symbol of Lena's quiet grace. The midnight train was set up on a low stage at the far end of the room, not playing the loud celebratory music of a birthday party, but a soft, sophisticated jazz, a gentle, soulful rhythm that filled the room with a sense of warmth and camaraderie. I arrived early, wanting to be there to greet my guests, to be the host of the evening in every sense of the word. As I stood near the entrance, a strange sense of peace settled over me. This felt right. This felt like something Lena would have loved. She had never been one for ostentatious displays, but she had loved bringing people together. She had loved the hum of happy conversation, the clinking of glasses, the feeling of a room full of friends, and that is what this was. The guests began to arrive, a steady stream of faces from every chapter of my life. Judge Henderson, a man I had known for 30 years, came over and clasped my hand in both of his. "Theo," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "What a wonderful tribute. An absolutely wonderful tribute to an unforgettable woman. Dr. Evans and his wife followed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Lena would have been so proud, Theo, she whispered, giving my arm a gentle squeeze. The Watsons from our old neighborhood, the younger couples I had mentored in my engineering firm, the members of Lena's church choir, they all came to me not with the polite, distant air of people attending a mandatory charity event, but with the genuine warmth of friends coming to support one of their own. They spoke of Lena sharing small, precious memories. One remembered a piece of advice she had given. Another remembered her laugh. Another the taste of a pie she had brought to a potluck years ago. They were not just honoring her memory. They were bringing her back to life in that room, story by story. And as they spoke to me, they looked at me with a respect that was so profound, so freely given. It was like a balm on the raw, open wound of the past week. In this room, I was not an irrelevant old man who ruined the vibe. I was Theodore Coleman, Lena's husband, a man of substance, a pillar of the community, a friend. I was a patriarch, not by virtue of my money, but by virtue of a life lived with honor. The foundation I was celebrating was not just the one I was creating for future students. It was the one Lena and I had built over a lifetime, a foundation of love, friendship, and mutual respect. And as the beautiful room filled with the sound of soft music and warm laughter, I felt it solid and unshakable beneath my feet. This was my world, and the barbarians were about to arrive at the gate. Just as the evening was reaching its comfortable cruising altitude, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the room. It was not a loud or sudden change, but a quiet, rippling wave of awareness that began near the entrance and spread slowly across the ballroom. The gentle hum of conversation dipped for a moment. Heads turned not in a rude or obvious way, but with a slow, casual curiosity. A new variable had been introduced into the equation. They had arrived. They stood framed in the grand entryway for a moment, a perfect tragic portrait of wealth and misery. Ashley was a masterpiece of strategic deception. She wore a stunning emerald green dress that shimmered under the soft lights, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant style. Her makeup was flawless, her smile a bright, beautiful, and utterly convincing lie. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. She looked like the proud, supportive wife. But her eyes, if you looked closely, were like the eyes of a cornered animal, constantly scanning the room, assessing threats, calculating angles. Her hand rested on her husband's arm, not for support, but for control, her fingers gripping his expensive suit jacket with a desperate, hidden tension. And Marcus, my son, was a ghost. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but it seemed to hang on him as if he had shrunk inside it. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow and haunted. He was performing the role of the dutiful son, but his body was betraying him at every turn. His shoulders were slumped, his movements were stiff and unnatural. He was a man walking to his own execution, and the effort of pretending he was a guest of honor was draining the very life force from him. They were a stunning, tragic couple, a living embodiment of a beautiful lie. As they began to walk through the room toward the table that Eleanor had strategically placed for them near the front, a gauntlet of polite greetings began. People turned to smile and nod. "Marcus, Ashley, so good to see you." They had to stop to perform. Ashley was brilliant. Her smile never wavered. Her voice was warm and gracious. "John, so lovely to see you." "Yes, isn't this a wonderful tribute? We are so incredibly proud of him." She was a master actress playing the part of her life. Marcus, however, could barely manage a weak, trembling smile. He mumbled greetings, his eyes avoiding contact, his handshake limp and clammy. He was a terrible actor. His shame was a tangible thing, a dark cloud that clung to him, visible to anyone who cared to look. And people were looking. The curiosity in the room was a palpable force. These people were not fools. They had seen the original birthday invitations. They had heard the whispers of a sudden cancellation. And now this. A grand public gala in Lena's name with the son and daughter-in-law looking like the star witnesses at a trial. The story did not add up. And the entire room, this army of witnesses I had so carefully assembled, was now watching and listening and waiting for the truth to be revealed. I watched them complete their long, humiliating walk across the room and finally take their seats. I did not feel a sense of triumph. I felt only a profound, aching sadness. The trap I had set was perfect, and the sight of my own son so utterly broken and trapped within it was the most painful victory of my life. After the last plates from the dinner service had been cleared away, a gentle hush fell over the ballroom. The soft jazz of the midnight train faded into a single lingering note from the saxophone, leaving behind a silence that was not empty but filled with a quiet, respectful anticipation. A single spotlight bloomed on the small stage at the front of the room, illuminating a lectern. And then Eleanor Dubois, looking regal and elegant in a deep blue gown, walked from her table and ascended the small set of stairs. She moved with a grace and purpose that commanded the attention of the entire room. She was no longer just my friend and co-conspirator. She was the master of ceremonies, the narrator of the story we were about to tell. She adjusted the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice was warm, clear, and carried to every corner of the magnificent room. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her eyes sweeping across the assembled guests, a small, genuine smile on her face. "My name is Eleanor Dubois, and on behalf of our host this evening, I want to thank you all for being here. It is a rare and beautiful thing to see a room so full of friendship, of community, of shared history. It is a testament to the man we are here to honor tonight and to the incredible woman whose memory we are here to celebrate." She paused, her smile softening into something more personal, more nostalgic. Many of you in this room knew Lena Coleman. Some of you knew her for 50 years, some of you for 5. But I think everyone who ever had the privilege of knowing her would agree that to know Lena was to know what true grace looked like. She was a woman of quiet strength, of fierce loyalty, and of a generosity of spirit that was as natural to her as breathing. My eyes found Marcus and Ashley at their table. Marcus was staring down at his hands, a man refusing to look at his own judgment. Ashley was a statue, a perfect smiling statue, her eyes fixed on Eleanor with an unblinking intensity. Lena believed in people. Eleanor continued, her voice resonating with a deep, emotional truth. She believed that a community is only as strong as its willingness to invest in its own future. She spent her life quietly lifting people up, offering a word of encouragement here, a helping hand there. She didn't seek recognition. Her reward was simply in seeing others succeed. This foundation. The Lena Coleman Educational Foundation is not just a memorial to her. It is a continuation of her life's work. It is a promise that her belief in the power of community and the potential of our young people will continue to shine, to inspire, and to change lives for generations to come. A ripple of soft, respectful applause went through the room. Eleanor let it fade before she continued. This incredible act of philanthropy, this promise to the future, is the vision of one man, a man who was Lena's partner, her rock, her greatest love for 50 years. A man who is now choosing to honor her legacy not by looking back at the past, but by building a bridge to the future. She turned her gaze from the audience and looked directly at me, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride, friendship, and a deep shared understanding. He is a quiet man, a man of substance rather than style, a man who has always preferred the integrity of a well-built structure to the emptiness of a loud speech. But tonight he has a story to tell, a story of love, of legacy, and of a promise kept. It is my profound honor and my great personal pleasure to introduce my dear friend, the founder of the Lena Coleman Educational Foundation, Mr. Theodore Coleman. The room erupted in applause, a warm rolling wave of respect and affection. It was a sound that seemed to lift me from my chair. I stood up, smoothed the front of my suit jacket, and began my own slow, deliberate walk to the stage, to the single waiting spotlight, to the moment of truth. As I stood at the lectern, the warmth of the spotlight felt like a familiar embrace. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the friends and neighbors who had woven the fabric of my life, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I adjusted the microphone, my hands steady, and then I saw them. At a table near the front, my son and his wife. He was staring at his plate. She was looking right at me, her smile a perfect, beautiful, and utterly meaningless piece of social armor. I did not look away. I held her gaze for a single long moment, and then I began to speak, not to her, not even to the room, but to the memory of the woman who had given my life its meaning. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said, my voice quiet but carrying easily through the silent ballroom. "Thank you all for being here tonight. To see so many friends in one room, it does an old man's heart good." I paused, letting my eyes drift to the portrait of Lena that had been placed on an easel beside the stage. I have been asked to say a few words about the foundation we are launching tonight, but to do that, I have to tell you a love story, because this foundation, like everything good in my life, began with Lena. I met her when I was 22 years old. I was a young, struggling engineer with more ambition than sense, and she was a nursing student with a laugh that could make a rainy day feel like sunshine. We had nothing. Our first apartment was 2 small rooms above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread was our alarm clock, and our rent was always a week late. We were poor, but we never felt poor, because we had each other. And as Lena used to say, a house with love in it is a mansion no matter how small the rooms are. I remember the day we bought the land on Elm Street. It was just an overgrown lot with a big stubborn oak tree in the middle. We stood there holding hands, and I saw a field of weeds, but Lena saw a home, and for the next 2 years we built it with our own hands. I would come home from my job at the engineering firm, and we would work until the sun went down. I learned about framing and drywall. Lena learned about plumbing and electrical. I remember her face smudged with dirt, her hair tied up in a scarf, wrestling with a roll of insulation and laughing. Always laughing. I was the engineer. I continued, my voice growing softer with the memory. I built the structure. I made sure the walls were straight and the roof didn't leak. I built the house. But it was Lena who turned that house into a home. It was Lena who planted the garden, who coaxed roses from the stubborn Georgia clay. It was Lena who filled those rooms with the smell of baking bread, with the sound of music, with friends and neighbors who were always welcome at our table. I built the container. She provided the contents, and the contents were love. Simple, unconditional, everyday love. She taught me that value isn't something that comes with a price tag. She taught me that the strongest foundations are not made of concrete, but of kindness, of integrity, of the promises you keep to the people you love. She saw the world not as a collection of things to be acquired, but as a community to be nurtured. Last year I sold that house. The walls I had built, the garden she had planted, it's all gone now. But the value of that home, the legacy of the love that was built there, that is not gone. It is indestructible. And that legacy is the seed from which this foundation now grows. We are taking the love that filled that small house on Elm Street, and we are planting it in the futures of young people we may never even meet. That is the story I wanted to tell. A story of a girl with a beautiful laugh and a boy who loved her. A story of a house that became a home. And a story of a love that I hope will continue to build things for a long, long time to come. Thank you. I let the applause soften a gentle wave of warmth that settled over the room. I looked out at the faces of my friends, and then for a brief moment my eyes met my son's. He was looking at me now, his face a mask of raw, unfiltered anguish. I did not hold his gaze. This speech was not for him. It was for her. I took a sip of water, the silence in the room patient and profound. But that love story, I continued, my voice a little stronger now, the story of that house is only the first chapter. The second chapter is about a dream. It wasn't my dream, it was Lena's. My wife was the most intelligent person I have ever known. She had a mind that was sharp and curious, a mind that could see the beauty in a complex piece of music or the elegance in a mathematical equation. But she never had the opportunity to go to college. Her family couldn't afford it. She became a nurse, and she was a brilliant one, but a part of her always felt the quiet ache of a door that had been closed to her. Because of that, I said, leaning slightly into the microphone, she saw education as the most precious gift a person could receive. She saw it as a key that could unlock a world of possibilities that she had only been able to look at through a window. She believed that talent was everywhere, in every neighborhood, in every home, but that opportunity was not. And she believed it was our sacred duty as a community to build doors where there were only walls. I remember a young boy in our old neighborhood, David. A bright, funny kid, but he was getting into trouble. His father had left his mother work 2 jobs. He was smart, but he was falling through the cracks. Lena saw him. She didn't just see a problem kid. She saw a brilliant mind that was starving for a challenge. She started inviting him over after school. She didn't lecture him. She just sat with him at our kitchen table, the one we had built together, and she helped him with his homework. She talked to him about books. She asked him what he wanted to be. No one had ever asked him that before. When it came time for him to apply to college, he told her it was impossible. His grades weren't perfect and they had no money. Lena spent a month with him, poring over applications, helping him write his essays. She found a small local scholarship for kids from his background, one that no one else had even bothered to look for. He got it. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a door. That young man, David, is now Dr. David Chen, a professor of physics at Georgia Tech. He still sends me a Christmas card every year. I paused, letting the story settle. That was Lena's dream. It wasn't about writing big checks or having her name on a building. It was about seeing the potential in a single child and providing the one small key that could unlock it. She believed that every time a child from our community went to college, the entire community got stronger. She believed that we rise together. This foundation is not my idea. It is the culmination of her dream. It is the institutionalization of the work she was already doing quietly, one child at a time, at our kitchen table. We are taking the love and the belief she poured into that one boy, and we are creating a reservoir of it for generations to come. We are building 1,000 doors for 1,000 brilliant kids who right now are standing in front of a wall, believing it's the end of the road. Lena knew it was just the beginning, and with this foundation, her work, her dream, will never, ever end. The applause that followed was warm and sustained a genuine appreciation for the story of my wife. I let it wash over me, a gentle tide of community and shared memory. I looked at the faces in the crowd, and I saw not just friends, but believers. They believed in the story of Lena, and now it was time to turn that story into a promise. And so, I said, my voice ringing with a new and final authority, it is my great honor to officially announce the launch of the Lena Coleman Educational Foundation. I paused, letting the words settle. To ensure that this foundation is not just a dream, but a powerful and lasting force for good in this community, I am endowing it with an initial investment. I looked down for a moment as if checking my notes, but my eyes went straight to the table where my son and his wife were sitting. I saw Ashley lean forward, her body tense, a flicker of something desperate in her eyes. I looked back up at the audience. An initial investment, I repeated, my voice clear and strong, of $250,000. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a thunderous, spontaneous wave of applause that was so powerful it seemed to shake the very floor beneath my feet. It went on and on, a deafening roar of approval. I saw Ashley flinch as if the sound were a physical blow. Marcus, my son, simply closed his eyes, a man surrendering to his own execution. I let the applause continue for a moment, a public referendum on the choice I had made. Then I raised my hand for quiet. But a foundation is not just about a number, I said as the room fell silent once more. It is about people, and I did not want to leave here tonight with just the promise of a future. I wanted to start that future, right now, in this room. A murmur of intrigue rippled through the audience. For the past week, with the help of some friends on the admissions boards at our local universities, I have been reviewing the applications of some of this city's brightest, most deserving high school seniors. And there was one story that Lena would have fallen in love with. It is the story of a young woman from the south side of our city. A young woman who has maintained a perfect 4.0 grade point average while working 30 hours a week at a diner to help support her 2 younger siblings after her father passed away. A young woman who volunteers on Saturday mornings to read to the elderly at a nursing home. A young woman who wrote in her application essay, "I do not see my circumstances as a burden, but as the fire that has forged my character." A young woman who dreams of becoming a doctor, not to be rich, but to return to her own community and provide the kind of care that her family could never afford. She is a young woman, I said, my voice thick with emotion, who is the living embodiment of everything my wife believed in. She is here with us tonight. She was invited as a guest, and she has no idea what is about to happen. I scanned the room, my eyes finding her at a table near the back, a look of stunned, dawning disbelief on her face. "Miss Imani Washington," I said, my voice ringing with pride. "Would you please join me on this stage?" The room exploded. Every single person, every judge, doctor, and CEO rose to their feet, their applause a deafening, emotional roar as this young, terrified, brilliant girl in a simple dress she had probably bought at a thrift store made her way through the maze of tables. She walked up the stairs, her eyes shining with tears. I took her hand. It was trembling. I turned with her to face the audience, and with my other hand I took the cream-colored envelope from the lectern. "Imani," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "On behalf of my late wife Lena and the Lena Coleman Foundation, it is my profound honor to present you with our very first scholarship, a full 4-year scholarship to the university of your choice." The applause was so loud, so overwhelming, it felt like the roof was going to come off the building. Imani sobbed a sound of pure, life-altering joy. and I looked out at the crowd at the sea of tear-streaked smiling faces. And I saw my son, his head in his hands, weeping with a shame so profound it was a physical collapse. And I saw his wife Ashley. She was still smiling. A perfect, beautiful, frozen smile. But her eyes were filled with a hatred so pure, so absolute, it could have burned the world to the ground. As the thunder of applause finally began to soften, receding like a great warm tide, I stood on the stage with my arm around Imani Washington's shaking shoulders. She was still weeping quiet tears of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude tracing paths down her cheeks. I handed her my own handkerchief, an old soft piece of linen that Lena had embroidered with my initials decades ago. It felt fitting that it should be used to dry these specific tears. This single beautiful moment was the culmination of my entire plan. It was the perfect final chord in a symphony of restored honor. I looked out at the sea of smiling, emotional faces, and for the first time in a very long time I felt a sense of profound, unshakable peace. I had done right by my wife. And then I felt it. A quiet, insistent vibration in the pocket of my suit jacket. My phone. A small, modern intrusion into a moment that felt timeless. My first instinct was to ignore it. Nothing in the world could be more important than what was happening right now. But the vibration was a loose thread in a perfect tapestry, and I felt a strange compulsion to pull it. With my arm still around Imani, I reached into my pocket and discreetly pulled out my phone. The screen was bright in the dimming light of the ballroom. There was one new message. My heart gave a slow, heavy beat as I saw the name of the sender, Brianna. My thumb, which felt clumsy and thick, hovered over the screen. I took a breath, and then I opened the message. There were only 4 words. 4 small, simple words that carried the weight of a world of pain, of regret, of a truth finally understood. "Grandpa," the message read, "I'm so sorry." I stood there, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight, surrounded by the sound of 100 happy conversations, and a single tear, hot and heavy, escaped my eye and traced a slow path down my cheek. It was not a tear of victory. It was not a tear of joy or of sadness. It was a tear for everything that had been lost, and for the tiny, fragile seed of what might one day be regained. I looked out at the crowd, my gaze sweeping past the smiling faces of my friends, my allies, my community. My eyes found their table one last time. I saw my son finally lifting his head, his face a ruin of shame and grief. And I saw Ashley, her perfect, terrible smile still frozen on her face, her eyes 2 chips of ice in the warm golden room. I did not feel hatred for them. I did not feel triumph over them. In that moment, I felt almost nothing for them at all. They were a problem that had been solved, a structure that had been condemned. My gaze shifted back to the room, to the legacy of a life well lived that was reflected in the faces of the people who had loved us. I did not reply to Brianna's text, not yet. The apology was the first step on a very long road. Forgiveness, if it was to have any meaning at all, had to be earned, not just requested. But for the first time, I felt the possibility of that road. I had not set out to destroy my family. I had set out to save its soul, to teach a hard and necessary lesson about the things that have real value. I had defended my dignity. I had honored my wife's memory. I had taken the ugliest parts of their character and I had built something beautiful from the ashes. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The war was over. The foundation had been laid. And in the quiet, peaceful center of my own heart, order had finally been restored. I learned that money is a tool, not a measure of love. For years I used it to build bridges to my family, believing generosity could fill the growing distance. But true respect isn't bought. It's earned through character and preserved by boundaries. The most valuable inheritance you can leave isn't a trust fund, but a legacy of self-worth. Sometimes protecting that legacy means letting go of the very people you hoped to give it to, forcing them to learn that dignity has a price their entitlement can never afford. That is the lesson my 75 years have taught me. What about you? What would you have done in my shoes? I would be honored to read your thoughts, so please leave them in the comments below. If this story has resonated with you, show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you for listening.